You're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Darby. I'm very pleased to welcome Rod Morri, the godfather of Australian golf podcasting, to the interview chair for today's episode. A self-confessed tabloid hack, Morri's Monday musings for Golf Australia magazine are a weekly can't miss, being certain to provoke and indeed often cajole readers to consider the challenges and opportunities within the wider golfing landscape in a slightly different way or with a new perspective. Many of these themes are investigated and teased out in more detail through the Good podcast vehicle that Morri co-pilots with Messrs Logue and Emmanuel. Rod's been podcasting since the days of online audio, which I'm reliably informed appears to be what they were called before the advent of the eponymous Apple iPod. He includes the names Mike Clayton, Geoff Shackleford, John Huggan, Derek Duncan, Connor Lewis and Karen Harding as both collaborators and devotees through the Talking Golf network of podcast publications. I've been fortunate to get to know Rod over the past year, and while it took some time to convince him that people would like to listen to an episode devoted exclusively to him, I really do think that this episode gives us a rare opportunity to get to know one of Australia's most prolific golf media protagonists. Many thanks for tuning in. I really do hope you enjoy this wide-ranging chat with Rodney John Morri. Rod Morri, you're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast.
I'm very honoured and privileged to have been asked, I must say, Shane.
Mate, an appearance for you is long overdue. As you know, you're one of the main influences that have motivated me to create the Firm and Fast Podcast in the first place. I understand that the Sydney summer has been somewhat inclement. Wondering, has it stopped raining yet?
Off and on. It has been the wettest one I can remember for a long time. What it does mean, though, if you look to the future, at some point in the next year or two, we're going to get a really hot summer, which means all this water that's in the ground now is going to make things grow really, really, really fast. And you know where we're going to be in a few years, Shane? We're going to be back to bushfires like we had a couple of years ago. That's the cycle and the pattern. But no, it's certainly eased off the last few weeks. I know Logue's been scratching his golf itch, which was not possible for a while there when it was pelting down constantly. So.
Yeah, I've seen some footage online of retro clothes and watches and so on and so forth himself, and maybe Ewan Porter perhaps, and Jimmy Emmanuel.
They're the cool kids. They formed a bit of a group, and they're kind of the cool kids, and they wear the cool Angus and Grace Go golfing clothing, which I've not seen yet, but apparently Clayton endorses that, so they obviously know what they're doing there. And they've been travelling around, to their eternal credit, they've been travelling around to all the public golf courses in Sydney. We had Ewan on our podcast a few weeks ago, and he told us he'd set himself this mission to play every public golf course in Sydney. And there's some not great ones in there, I've got to tell you, Shane. So, and that's what they've been up to. They've been having these days where they go out and play public golf, which is one of the topics we often talk about on our podcast, as you know, and the importance of it. So putting their teas where their mouth is, so to speak, and good on them for doing it.
Yeah, well, look, having welcomed both Logue and Clayton on the pod over the past year or so, I'm very pleased, as I said, to have you join me on the show. It did take a little convincing, but I can assure you that myself and many of the listeners would like to learn a bit more about your journey through golf and its myriad forms. Writing, obviously, podcast, presenting, golf course architecture, epiphanies perhaps through the years, and let's not forget your founding father status of Retro Wednesdays at Mangrove Mountain.
You're very kind, and you've outlined some of my biggest failures there for me, which is great. I'm not super comfortable in this position, Shane, which is why it took some convincing to get me here. I've never been keen on being the guest. I feel like I do too much of espousing of my own opinions as a host, let alone being a guest somewhere where it's kind of all about espousing your opinions. So that's the reason for my reticence. Nothing to do with you, who I quite like.
You're very kind, sir. You're very kind. You know, in considering today's first question, Rod, I'm compelled to ask you, what's the thing about golf, Rod Morri?
It's such a wanky thing to say. It's a journey. As you're probably going to reveal a bit later, I almost never play golf anymore, and I don't find myself loving it any less than the years and years and years where it was all I wanted to do was play golf. I think for me, other people might have this about other sports, but you would have heard me say it a million times. I think golf is unique. And one of the things that I think is really unique about it, it is incredibly cerebral. You can immerse yourself in golf without touching a golf club. Now, I don't think you can do that if you've never touched a golf club, or it's unlikely. But if you've had the golf bug and played a lot, which I have done, and I know quite a few people like this, you actually don't really need to play anymore to be just as engaged with the game as you always have been. I think you do lose something by not playing on a regular basis, and I feel that over the last year or two in some sense. But that, I think, is the thing about golf for me. What did Palmer say? It's endlessly fascinating, and it is. I think it's endlessly fascinating. If you can like the clubs. I have some affinity with people who like, well, the retro clubs. You can be into modern gear. You can be into the golf swing. You can be into golf course architecture. You can, it's not a great life choice, but you can be a rules type person should you want to. Be fascinated with the rules of the game. The writing on the game is probably one of the things I think that keeps it so engaging. Not my own, but others. There's that, I think it was George Plimpton said, the smaller the ball, the better the writing. They don't get much smaller than golf. And I think there's some truth to that. It's not universally true, obviously. There's some fabulous sports writing about other sports, but I think it's the ability to sort of intellectually, for want of a better term, immerse yourself in the game. Other sports to me look very much like they kind of happen, and that's kind of that. Football's quite simple. Soccer is quite simple, or seems to me. Golf's incredibly complex. It's the chess to the checkers that is a lot of mainstream sport. Does that answer the question somewhat?
It certainly does. When did golf first appear on young Rod's horizon?
I reckon I was thinking about this because I don't think about it much. I was probably about 14 or 15, and we have tobacco to thank. I was a smoker at school as a student. I think I was in year 9, and one of the school sports that was offered was golf. I was never into sport, never liked sport. We had to play sport. I went to a Catholic school, so you had to play something. So I generally went for cricket in the summer because there wasn't so much running and sweating and bashing into other people and all that sort of thing, which wasn't my go. So they offered golf, and myself and another couple of my mates said, well, this would be great. You go play golf. Well, once you're at the first green, they can't see anymore. You can smoke. So we picked golf. Nothing to do with the game itself. And I loved it. Maybe not the very first day, but after not many weeks, we used to have school sport on a Thursday afternoon. I really loved it. We really, really, really enjoyed it for all the reasons that we do. Initially, because you're out there with your mates and we could smoke, which we thought was fantastic, but you're out there with your mates having fun and doing stuff on the golf course you probably shouldn't do. But then the game itself kind of captivated me, and I only really thought about this morning before we started because I knew you were going to ask this question. I didn't go on with it then. My parents joined me up as a junior member at that local semi-private golf club near where we lived and where we played each Thursday. And I only sort of lasted a year. I don't recall meeting any other kids. There was nothing there was no incentives to go and play or use the golf course. And I kind of, much as I still loved golf, I was fascinated by the game. I really loved it. I had my clubs and all that. Never really used that membership and kind of fell out of the game till I was about 18 or 19. I met Brendan James, who's the editor at Golf Australia magazine here in Sydney. I met him at News Limited. We were both copy boys there. I'd known him for a couple of months. Didn't know at the time. He not only played golf, he was a very good player. He got down to 2, played Pennant in Sydney and could really play the game, had played for a long time. And we were on our way to they had these summer series concerts in Australia back in the 80s and early 90s called Big Day Out. Lots and lots and lots of headline bands at a big oval, and you'd sneak in some booze and, carry on like teenagers and young people. There'd be loud music and that sort of thing. Music's not really my thing, but it was the sort of thing you'd do when you were young. We were walking to the venue from the train station nearest to it, and we walked past a golf course. And BJ just said out of nowhere, I haven't played golf for ages. And I said to him, or it might have been the other way around, I said to him, do you play? And he said yes. And that conversation morphed into a round of golf a few days later. And eventually, he's the editor of Golf Australia magazine. I do golf podcasts and write for his magazine. That's where it ended up. But that's kind of where it restarted. Had that not happened, I may have just continued my, at the time, very in-depth research into alcohol, cigarettes and women.
No, all good. So when and where did you start writing about golf?
So I left News Limited in about 93, 94. I was a bit of a lost soul. I think I got a job pouring beer at a Greek-based soccer club here in Australia called Sydney Olympic. I worked in the bar there and trained, that might have been later, and somewhere in there I did training to work at the Sydney Casino, which I did 2 stints at the casino as a croupier. The golf, well, of course, one of the great things about being a reporter, doing your trade, it's completely portable. If you've got an interest and you've got some of those skills that we learned at News Limited as cadets, well, you can transfer it to whatever you're interested in. It can be travel writing, it can be, obviously the ones that obviously in newspapers, politics and those sorts of things. And mine was golf. And so there was a local newspaper publication down here in the mid-90s, 1995 I think it was, called The Golfer, very creatively titled, which was a pretty simple operation. They had an ad salesman. It was published out of Queensland, not here in New South Wales. And it just needed to be filled with golf stories. And so to find golf stories to fill a golf paper, you need the skills that I'd learnt at Newsman. So it wasn't a full-time job. It was kind of a sideline hustle. They would pay you sort of, not so much freelance rates, but like a retainer to do a certain amount of stuff. And that's how I got into golf writing more about, well, I can remember one of the most memorable things I think I ever did was go to the Australian Junior Girls Championship at Bonnie Doon, well before it was redone. We'd be talking in the mid to late 90s here. And I remember that, and this is where the journey of my interest in other aspects of golf, I guess, started. I remember being struck by the number of dads who were caddying for their daughters. Now, a lot of these girls were between sort of 14 and 17 years old, that kind of age group. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, there might be something special about this game. What are the other things that dads and daughters can do at that age? I don't have children, but I imagine that for a dad, a 14-year-old daughter, that's an awkward kind of age for engagement. And golf offered this amazing thing. Now, not all of it was good. Not all of them had great relations. There was a fair few girls crying, obviously, on the course, and there were a few dads who were crying too. But I just thought, it was one of the amazing aspects of golf. I guess I started to think about the game a little bit more broadly because, a bit more broadly than just, here's a game where, as Logue calls them, you're a look-downer. There's the ball, there's the hole, how many shots did it take you to get in, and that's the sum total of the game. There's nothing wrong with that, but I started to see more than just that, I think.
Yes, so maybe, looking up perhaps and sort of taking a look at your initial interest in golf course architecture. From listening to you and speaking with you, I get the feeling that your fascination with golf course architecture is probably indelibly linked with a golfing trip that you took to Ireland, Scotland and England maybe back in the late 1990s with the aforementioned Brendan James of Golf Australia magazine. Will I be correct in this summation?
You would be completely correct. It was almost a spiritual experience. It was 1997. We planned, when I say we, I'm a passenger on these things. The big man, BJ, he loves to organise. And this was before the internet, really. He organised this entire trip. I think we played 36 or 37 rounds in 32 days. We had a couple of rest days in there as well where we didn't play. We went to the Open. So the whole trip was built around going to the Open and covering the Open, which made it, how can we put it, a tax write-off. So that was nice. But yes, we were both from Sydney. He was a much more advanced golfer than I was. But in Sydney, there's very little, certainly very little accessible that you would call of architectural interest. Sydney's people who would be familiar with Riviera. Sydney could have a Riviera, but we don't. We've got very sort of formulaic golf for the most part in Sydney. Even the clubs that have been revered, a lot of that is changing. We're sort of lots and lots more golfers have an interest in architecture these days, and so that's to the good. But my experience of golf had been essentially kind of tree-lined, parkland golf courses, mostly public or semi-private. I'd had a few experiences at some nicer clubs, but they were all essentially kind of the same. And we landed in England. We started our trip, our first round was at Royal St George's. We were younger men then, so we were pretty hungover. In fact, BJ will hate me telling this story, so I must tell it. I may even tell it twice just to make sure that he hears it. His very first shot of the trip, he's a much better player than me. His very first shot of the trip at Royal St George's off the first tee was it wasn't a shank because he hit it with a driver, but it went that far right that it could have been a shank. I just remember, and he was hungover and not feeling well and not looking great. And I just remember I somehow hit the fairway and I was walking down the fairway and I looked across and there he was wandering aimlessly through the tall grasses. We've got a couple of guys here called Roy and HG who do a sort of a parody sports program, and they had this saying, like a hapless water buffalo wandering through the ponds of life. And that came to me as I watched poor old BJ searching for his probably a Titleist at the time. Would have been a Bellata, probably a Titleist 100 or something like that. He was searching for it in the long grass, and that was the start of our trip. But the golf, compared to here in Sydney, was confronting. And the initial reaction was, this can't be right. Golf doesn't look like this. You know, you could see right across the whole vista. And it's a pretty wild landscape there at Royal St George's. I mean, it's not everybody loves Royal St George's, but for us, the comparison from Royal St George's to, I don't know, pick a course in Sydney that people sort of, Concord, Killara, those North Shore sorts of courses, or even some of the courses in the east, probably a bit more like St Michael's than New South Wales, but it was a revelation. I didn't know golf could look like that and be like that. And at first, I don't think I particularly liked it. It was like, no, this is too much. Where's all the nice super green grass and all the pleasantries and the condition and all the things that you're used to? And then it just, obviously it happens. By the time we got to St Andrews, which was a couple of weeks into the trip from memory, St Andrews really was the epiphany moment that put it all together. We'd played Royal Cinque Ports and Princes, still two of the most memorable days, I think, of golf for me, coming from Sydney. But when we got to St Andrews, it had all of that and that wild sort of architecture and that sporty sort of golf, but it had the feel. I mean, it's the old course. You feel it. If you're a golfer, I think you feel it. It's almost embarrassing to admit, but it's almost a spiritual experience to go to the old course, I think, for the first time. And to stand and feel inadequate with a golf club on that land and think, I shouldn't be here. This is where the greats of the game have performed the greatest feats. And then to realise, actually, yeah, I should be here. Everybody should be here. And on Sundays, everybody is. Throwing frisbees and playing cricket and, kids building sandcastles in the bunkers. It's taken a long time to come to the realisation of what it was about the old course, but that's what it is. It's golf in its place where it belongs. We get it so wrong with golf so often outside of... And if you look to the old course, that's what golf could and should be. It's part of where it is. It's not about... And the look down part of it is part of it, of course. I birdied the road hole. I will tell that story again too before, but I birdied the road hole, and it's an extraordinary thing to have happened to a hapless water buffalo like me wandering aimlessly through the ponds of life. But that's part of it, but it's so much more than that, the old course. And so it was a revelation and an almost spiritual experience, and it really was an epiphany. It was a moment of like, wow, this is what golf should be, and it's not what golf is in so many places, and it's really not what golf is in most parts of Sydney. It certainly wasn't back then at the time.
Where else did you see?
BJ could run you through the whole list, I'm sure. In fact, he still has the giant A3 size. You remember the cardboard sheets you used to get to do your projects on for school when you were in primary school? He had one of those rolled up in a canister, and each evening, wherever we were staying, he'd roll it out and he'd fill out the scores of who had what. We had a match play that went for the whole thing. He wrote a great series for the magazine about the trip, and people didn't believe it. It really did come down to the last couple of holes of the trip before the match was decided. We were handicapping and that sort of stuff, so he would fill that out. Where else did we see? I will miss places for sure, but we played a lot of the hits in England. We did Birkdale, Lytham. God, name some courses for me because I'm going to forget. We did England, Scotland and Ireland, so we did sort of in the south of England, we did Princes, Cinque Ports, Royal St George's, obviously, Lytham, Liverpool, Hoylake, Birkdale. In Ireland, we did Lahinch, Ballybunion, Mount Juliet, which was a diversion from what we had been seeing. It was something different. Portmarnock, yeah.
Royal County Down.
No, we didn't do Royal County. No, we didn't because we didn't go north. We didn't go to Northern.
We didn't go north. All right.
It was marching season, and we were told by the hire car people that it wouldn't be a good idea to take the car with the English plates north of the border. I think it was something along those lines. And so that we hadn't factored that into the trip. We didn't go north. Tralee, Waterville. What's the one where the crazy guy owned the motor? He had the giant golf bag. He had a golf ball from every person, including the Secret Service. Every person who'd stayed there. What's his name? Michael. What's
European Club, Pat Ruddy.
No. The European Club. I'm not even sure if it was it built then? No, Kilkenny. Not Kilkenny. Started with a K.
At the K Club.
No, it wasn't the K. We didn't play there either. No. It'll come to me later. Loads. Now, I've now forgotten. I wish BJ was here or that he was awake so that I could text him and he would no doubt send me the comprehensive list. They were known courses because, of course, from Australia then, and this is one of the things that happened on that trip, everywhere we went, we'd play, for example, the Hinch during the day, and that night we'd be sitting in a bar or a restaurant somewhere in town, and people would go, "Oh, you're from Australia, what are you doing?" "Oh, we're playing golf." "Wherever you play, we played the Hinch." "Oh, it's not bad, but the place down the road here is way better." Of course, you'd never heard of it. Well, we didn't have the internet then. So you didn't know about these sort of hidden gems that hung off the name courses. So we were on a rotation of pretty much name golf courses. BJ had a book by Donald Steele, which was a directory of courses, I think, in the UK, and we picked a couple out of there. But for the most part, and when you come, as you know, when you've come to Australia, you know how long it takes to get here. If you have 4 weeks, and I didn't know it at the time, it was my only time to go to the UK and play golf, you kind of want to do the hits, don't you? I would probably do it differently now, but if you've only got that one shot and someone said to you, "Oh, this place down the road from the Hinch is better than the Hinch," you go, "Yeah, maybe it is, but it's not the Hinch." So I'm going to play the Hinch. That's what I'm going to do. So there was an element of that about it as well. We didn't have access to information about other courses. So it was a series of the hits, I guess, and just joyous, all of it joyous. What was one of the really interesting things I felt about the trip over there was the difference in culture and attitude between England and Ireland and Scotland. So almost all of the places we went to in England, so we played at Wentworth, for example. You had to be on your best behaviour there and watch your P's and Q's and all that sort of stuff. There was very much a feeling of you were lucky that they were letting you play there. In Ireland in particular, I found most of the places, they were staggered that you'd be from the other side of the world and want to play at their humble little golf course like the Hinch, or they couldn't wait to get you out there and tell you all about the course and welcome with open arms, and the pride and the joy that people would be interested in their facility was amazing. Less of that in Scotland, but incredibly friendly and, yes, please come and experience. This is wonderful. We want you to experience what we have here, which was very much different to, I think, England, and I don't know about the rest of your club system over there. In Australia, I think we've got more of the English model, as I do think they do in America. Broadly, golf and golfers are exclusionary. That would be overstating the sense of what I got from England, but not by a lot. There's much more of a feeling of trying to exclude people. We have this ritzy club. You need to meet these criteria to be a member, be they financial or whatever else they might be, as opposed to the sense that I got in Ireland and in particular Scotland, which was, hey, come and enjoy it, come and be a part of it. We welcome you. Now, it's actually quite a big difference. I think it's had a real impact on the game outside of Scotland. I blame the English. They exported the attitude with the game.
When you got back home after your post-St Andrews epiphany, how did you sort of satisfy that new interest, shall we say?
Well, you kind of can't physically for the most part in Sydney. Melbourne's probably got a lot more to offer in terms of golf course architecture. I spent quite a bit of time just being disappointed, to be honest with you, as a golfer. Very hard to have gone and had that and then come back and enjoy the golf aspect of golf in Sydney. I was never a member at a club in Sydney. I just used to play sort of work, and we'd go and do course reviews and those sorts of things. So I never had a handicap or any of that sort of stuff until sort of much later, sort of mid-2000s before I joined a club for the first time, which wasn't in Sydney. It was humble little Mangrove Mountain, as you mentioned in the intro there. So there was a lot of just sort of disappointment. I suppose that golf became... BJ and I did a lot of trips around that time. We were young, we were single, we're not particularly attractive, so it's kind of, what are you going to do? So we would go to the Gold Coast. We did a couple of regional sort of trips in the car where we'd do 3,000 or 4,000 Ks over the course of a week and just play a whole bunch of golf courses down on the border of New South Wales and Victoria, around the Morri region and those sorts of things. But the golf aspect, the golf course architecture aspect, much more a reading thing, I think. And even then that was harder than now. Now, if you've got an interest in golf course architecture, one of the wonderful things the internet has done is created this entire pool. You couldn't read all the golf course architecture stuff that's been published since sort of the mid-2000s that's online, places like Golf Club Atlas, Geoff Shackleford's website, what the Fried Egg do with all of their architecture. None of that. Certainly not a discussion. You could buy books and you could read pieces in magazines, but it was very much one-way communication. This discussion about golf course architecture sort of didn't really exist. And it's probably still true today, I think, in most golf clubs. If you've got a golf course architecture interest and you meet somebody else who has a golf course architecture interest, you'd yell snap, because the chances of there being two of you within one club, certainly back in the mid-2000s, were pretty slim. Most golfers don't really have an interest in the subject, and some have a real anti-bias again. You're snobs and not interested in golf course architecture and all that sort of stuff. So how did I sort of satisfy it? It wasn't easy. I went to Barnbougle Dunes for the first time in probably about, when did it open? I think it opened in 2004. Would have been not long after it opened. And this is actually how I ended up meeting Mike Clayton, of whom I was quite a fanboy because I would read his stuff in the magazines about golf course architecture and it would sort of hit nerves. And after we'd been to Barnbougle, and I was blown away by Barnbougle. I hadn't seen anything like it in Australia. I had not played, in fact, I've still not played much golf on the sandbelt of Melbourne. I've only played Royal Melbourne, I think, once, maybe twice. Never played the composite course there. I think I've only played Victoria once, Huntingdale. Never played Kingston Heath, played Metropolitan. Never played Peninsula Kingswood. So I haven't got great sort of experiences down on the sandbelt. I've been there a lot and walked all those courses at various tournaments and whatnot, but not played them much. But we went to Barnbougle Dunes for a first trip and was just blown away by it, as most people are. And it must have been a couple of months later, there was a tournament at Concord. Might have been the New South Wales Open, and Clates was playing. And of course I thought Clates was a hero, a superstar, and I saw him on the practice green. And I was literally shaking. I was so nervous, but I thought, I've got to go and say to this guy, I just love Barnbougle Dunes. What you and Tom Doak did there is just really special, and you should be told that at every opportunity. That was the first time I ever met Clates. I'm sure I made a bumbling fool of myself trying to sort of say all that. And it would have been a year or two later that I kind of then got to know him through other ways. I had him as a guest on my very early podcast I did around that time, sort of 2001 to, I can't remember when I first started talking golf, 2005, something like that. Then came to know him after that. But yeah, so that was sort of how that happened. And yeah, just talk. So with my podcast with Talking Golf that I started way back then, I did quite a bit of architecture stuff. I remember interviewing Ben Crenshaw and Tom Doak on that Talking Golf show. That would have been 2002, 2003. Both of them long before you sort of started to see them bob up. You'd only read about these guys and only if you knew where to go looking. And that's, I guess, how I satisfied, how I still satisfy for the most part, my interest in golf course architecture. Because I don't have the golf skills to really appreciate golf course architecture. Speaking of Clayton and Barnbougle Dunes, I must tell this story because it's one of the more remarkable stories. I had the extraordinary pleasure to play about 12 or 14 holes at Barnbougle Dunes, the Dunes course with Clates. We organised a state of the game architecture tour to Barnbougle Dunes, and we came back from the Lost Farm course one afternoon, and Clates goes, "There's plenty of light, let's grab the clubs and go out and have a hit." And I was like, okay, wow, this is embarrassing, but it's not an opportunity I'm going to miss. So we're playing the 15th hole at Barnbougle Dunes, which it's a short par 4, huge sand dune on the left, the wind blowing off the water there on the right as the wind was howling. Anyway, Clates says to us, "You see that little sort of knob in the fairway there?" As only Clates can. Yeah, up on the right on the right-hand side. He said, yeah. Well, just over the top of that, he said, there's a flat spot that's a perfect angle to the green. He's like, that's what you want to aim for. And he pulls out a drive and the wind's howling and he just pops this ball into this spot that when we get up there and walk around the dune, it turns out to be about the size of a full-size snooker table. And it is perfect. It's flat. There's not a divot there. And, of course, Clates takes no interest in his own extraordinary shot that he's just played. All he's saying is, see, no one hits it here. No divots. No one even knows it's here. They can't. So, how did you do that, Clates? It's extraordinary. And he was... That was, 3 or 4 years ago, so, well into his late 50s, and just and to watch him play was, most people will never get the chance to play with the tour player, but Clates has made a living playing golf for the best part of 30 years. It's an extraordinary thing to see up close. And he's not a power guy. It's not like watching Rahm or McIlroy or Scott or any of those amazing things where the ball just fizzes and takes off. But what an extraordinary thing to watch up close, just a beautifully constructed golf game. Like what Clates had. That was one of probably the highlights of my golf playing career ever. But yeah, typical Clates. Yeah, see that journo? Just over the top of that, there's a flat spot. Nobody knows about it. Clates, you are one of a kind, my friend. Magnificent.
He plays every day, yeah?
I think so, pretty much most days. If he's not playing golf, he'll be walking a golf course. He's caddying for Elvis Smiley this week at the New Zealand Open. He's an extraordinary character. We won't appreciate Clates until we're long gone. people will look back at his writings a bit like they do with Mackenzie and say, why didn't we listen to this guy? Why didn't we listen to him more? I've been with him at more than one Australian Open where he's caddied for either Elvis Smiley, or if it's the Women's Open, he'll have caddied for Suo. And he'll go out in the morning, hit off at 6:30, caddy 18 holes in jeans in 35, 40-degree heat sometimes. He'll come in, have a couple of, maybe a cup of tea, some water, maybe a snack, and he'll say, oh, come on, let's go out. And he'll go out and walk another 18 holes with a player that he wants to have a look at. And I think it's a question you've probably got for later on, but one of life's great joys if you're a golfer is to walk and spectate at a tournament with Clates, because the commentary is not safe for work, but it's an insight that is just extraordinary. He has an amazing mind, and an amazing mind for golf, but an amazing mind beyond that. You know, the thing I like most about Clates is he's a golf geek, but his interests and his tastes and his intellectual hunger is way broader than just golf, and he brings a lot of that outside thinking into the way he thinks about golf. And I'm an unashamed and unabashed fan of Clayton, and always have been.
Tell me a little about the genesis of the State of the Game podcast. Yourself, Clayton and Geoff Shackleford.
Well, originally it was also John Huggan, and it started at the 2011 President's Cup. And I had at that time, various stages, each of those guys on the Talk and Golf podcast. And I used to do a live broadcast with that on a thing called Blog Talk Radio, really only for my own sort of benefit. But I would call on all of them quite often to talk about, the week's golf news and all sorts of stuff. So they all sort of knew each other as well independently, but it was just everyone was going to be at the 2011 President's Cup. So I was like, we better organise to go and, catch up at the President's Cup. So we were sitting around a table in the media centre at the President's Cup at Royal Melbourne in 2011. And I don't know who it was. It might have been Huggy, it might have been Shaq, it might have been me. I doubt it would have been me. I wouldn't have been bold enough to suggest that these three guys give their time to do a regular podcast with all of them on it. But the idea sort of followed. Said, look, we really should do something. We were talking, if I recall, we were talking about something along the lines of, how do you educate the golfing public without talking down to them about some of these issues? We were on an architecture high, all of us, because we're sitting at Royal Melbourne. It's just such a special place. And it was born out, I don't know who eventually said it, but it was like, we should do a podcast. So I had the technical skills to make it happen, where, 12 years down the track, Clayton still doesn't have the microphone skills to do it properly, yet his contribution is still worthwhile. And so we did, and originally it was going to be quite a regular thing, and tough to organise. We had 3 time zones in play. I'm in Sydney, Clayton's in Melbourne, Shaq's in LA, and Huggy was in Scotland. So it was awkward always to get all of them together. It's bad enough when you work across 2 time zones. It's early morning here, it's late evening for you, so it's doable, but it's not that simple, particularly if people have got families and that sort of thing. Not everybody appreciates, Bob sitting off in the room talking about golf at 8:30 at night while the family's sort of having dinner and whatnot. So it was a bit awkward. And then there was some tension between Huggy and Shaq in particular, and Huggy decided he didn't want to be part of the State of the Game anymore, which is fine. I still good mates with Huggy, still swap roles with him on a podcast that we do for Golf Australia magazine called The Thing About Golf. And we just continued on. So as most people will know, I've been abused more than people have stopped abusing us on Twitter. They did that for a while of, when's the next episode? What are you guys doing? It's quite sporadic. It could have been, if we were smarter or that way inclined. This is another media thing. Journos should not run media businesses, because the skills required to be a journo and the skills required to run a business, as I'm finding out, are very, very, very different. It could have been what No Laying Up and The Fried Egg have become, I think. It was kind of the first of that type of golf content, State of the Game. We started in 2011. I'm not sure when those others started. I would think probably 2014, 15, 16. They too grew organically, which is interesting, out of something smaller. I mean, Andy started his newsletter, which eventually turned into what is now a podcast, a network of podcasts, hugely popular. No Laying Up guys were the same. I think they just had a Twitter account to start, and they all kind of found each other, as Shackleford and Clayton and Huggy and I had. And they've built quite significant media businesses, but we never had the skills for doing the media business. And just, you've only got to look at the haphazard nature of the episode releases to see that that's never going to be a sensible business model. And not to mention the fact that on our very first episode, I Clayton put the boot into club car from memory. It was like, well, there's one sponsor that's just potential sponsor straight off the list. And that's, I think, as it should be. I'm quite glad that State of the Game is like that. It happens now when it kind of has to. Clayton will fire off an email to me and Shaq and say, we're going to have an episode, we've got to talk about this, or Shaq might do the same, or I might do the same, and then a week or two later. But which is not a knock on, this is how media works, but once you become a media business as opposed to just sitting around talking about the game as you and I are doing now, things change. If you've got sponsors, things change, whether you want them to or not. That changes things. It changes the nature of the content that you cover, changes the way you cover it. It has to, because you're then in a relationship. You're in a business relationship with entities that have an interest in what it is you're doing and saying on your show. We don't have that at State of the Game at all. Now, there are potential knock-on effects. I work at other organisations as well, and things that are said on State of the Game. It hasn't happened, but it wouldn't be beyond the realms of possibility for something that gets said on State of the Game to cause a problem for example, Golf Australia magazine. Hasn't happened, as I said. But there's a freedom about State of the Game. And the game's too important not to have that sort of commentary as well. I mean, I don't pretend to be a martyr and it's some kind of incredible responsibility, but it is important, and there's more of it now, which is good. Lots of other people are doing it. You're doing it in a way with this Firm and Fast podcast. I mean, all talks to the good of the game. But it's important that there be places where people can speak openly and freely about important issues. It's legitimate to criticise stuff about the game. It's legitimate to criticise manufacturers. It's legitimate to criticise us in the media as well. You know, these things don't have to be binary. I see that, there's plenty of stuff I've got wrong over time, and it's important that you be able to talk about that. And I feel like State of a Game is one of those places where we can talk about that, if that makes sense.
It does. I guess going back to the Talking Golf network, as it were, and I'm sure some listeners listen to Connor Lewis on the Talking History Golf podcast. I believe we have Rod, Morri and Adrian Logue to thank for in some small way
for Connor.
For Connor.
Yeah, that's right. He was nothing when I found him, and look at him now. He'd be nothing if I dump him again. No. We had Connor come on the I Seek Golf podcast that we did for a while. I Seek Golf was an offshoot. That's a long story. But Logue and I met at a place called GolfLink, which is the handicap administrator here in Australia. And the way the handicapping system was set up in Australia, or the administration of it, and the way people could access their handicaps, was through a third-party company called GolfLink. Golf Australia, the governing body, didn't take it on themselves, which in hindsight turned out to be a really stupid decision. But for all sorts of reasons at the time, there were clubs in Australia who refused to take part in the online handicapping system when it became a thing in the early 2000s. They didn't like the privacy angle of it, etc. So Golf Australia were looking to distance themselves from having all of that information and whatnot. So it was a third-party thing. And there was a company called GolfLink that did all of that. Logue's background is computers and that whole handicapping system. That's how he ended up there. I ended up there because, of course, the GolfLink page is the most viewed golf web page in Australia because people go there to check their handicaps. And so, of course, it wasn't long before somebody said, hey, if we could capture them for a bit of time, not just have them check their handicap and then go away, if we could keep them here for a bit of time, there's money to be made out of that. We can sell ads around editorial content and whatnot. So I started working at GolfLink because that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to have editorial content. And that's where I met Logue. And as it became fairly clear that GolfLink was going to go back to Golf Australia. They were doing a deal that Golf Australia would take it back in-house and that GolfLink would just be administrators, and that they'd purchased independently a separate website which had been very popular in Australia for a long time called I Seek Golf, predominantly a tee times and forum sort of a site. So we all started to then work for I Seek Golf instead of GolfLink. And I could sort of see the writing on the wall, and it was my attempt to remain there. I said to Logue, who was, in my eyes, quite senior at the company, we should start a podcast talking about golf. I thought this would be my way to hang on. They're not going to take one of their senior people and take the podcast off him. So we started a podcast at I Seek Golf called the I Seek Golf Podcast, because creativity's always been our strong suit, as you can imagine. And we had Connor on that podcast. It was actually pretty popular. It was the forerunner to the Good Golf podcast, which we do now. We essentially just, when I Seek Golf was sold off, we just started a new podcast doing the same thing. So we had Connor on the show, and anybody who's listened to the Talking Golf History podcast will know he is a fabulous talker, as in he doesn't stop talking. He's a passionate history buff, golf history buff, and he really knows his stuff, and he presents it in a way that is, in fact, even if you're not particularly interested in history, we assume history to be very dry and uninteresting, and he does present it in a way that's not that. And so I just suggested to him after we'd recorded the episode, oh, you should probably start. So I'm thinking about starting this network of golf podcasts. You should do a history podcast for that. Here we are. And the Talking Golf History podcast of all the podcasts on the Talking Golf Network is probably, it'll be neck and neck as the most popular with State of the Game in terms of the number of downloads it does. It's quite remarkable, the following that he has gathered around him. In that he's got the Twitter account that supports it, the Society of Golf Historians and all of that sort of stuff. But yes, so that's sort of how the Connor Lewis monster was born, was out of an I Seek Golf podcast episode.
Yeah, I mean, maybe going back to the Mike Clayton Appreciation Society, any opportunity you have to get him on, just get him on across the board. You know, he strikes me. I know Derek Duncan, I think, called him at one point the conscience of golf. You know, furthering the traditions of Von Nida and Thompson, and, you know, nurturing the game one golfer at a time. He really is a force of nature, isn't he?
He's cut of a mould that's rare. In fact, you touched on Derek there. Derek's Feed the Ball podcast is one of my favourites, and one of the reasons it's one of my favourites is because he does by far the greatest introductions of all time. I've been embarrassed and humbled by the preparation you've done for this podcast, and I've been embarrassed and humbled by the effort and time that he puts into crafting magnificent introductions for people. And you're right, he did say that about Clayton. It was fantastic. But all of his intros are great, Derek, and his podcast is fantastic. Yeah, I said it before. I really don't think we'll appreciate Clayton and his contribution to the game. It's very hard to in the moment. There's so much talk and activity and heat around all of these topics. But even after years of knowing him, he staggers me with how simply he can put things into perspective. You know, I'll wrestle with notions about distance and all the different stakeholders, and then he'll just say something that's like, yeah, you're right. We're just overcomplicating this ridiculously and unnecessarily. He really is. If you're not familiar with Mike Clayton, he has his detractors, and he's not always right. One of the things I like about Clayton is he knows he's not always right, and he's more than happy for you to talk him around to a position that he doesn't hold if you can convince him that it makes more sense than the position he does. He also doesn't pretend to know about things that he doesn't know about, which is a trap, I think, for most of us. I'm guilty of it sometimes. You know, you pretend like you must know a bit about this because you're expected to. He doesn't fall into that. He's got his topics. He writes beautifully. He really does. He's quite a gifted writer and an extraordinary player. He just brings a perspective. I mean, he would be embarrassed if you were to compare him to Thompson, and I wouldn't do it in that way. Thompson was a one-off. But he's in that mould. I think Matt Goggin is in that mould. They're professional golfers, but their contribution to the game ultimately will not be their playing legacy or career. It's going to be something much bigger than that. Even if you don't like Clates, you can learn something from him, and he's very funny. I remember I think we were on the left hand side of the 16th hole of par 5 at Royal Sydney at the Australian Open a few years ago, and Clates was sitting in a golf cart with Andrew Langford Jones, who was the famous rules official, who I must get on the thing about golf actually, for many years here in Australia. So Langers is a legend. Everybody knows Langers. He would have given rulings both for and against Clates a bunch of times over the course of his career.
He was tournament director of the Australian Masters when Tiger won before he crashed into the fire hydrant a week or two later, wasn't he?
Oh, I don't know if he's ever been tournament director. He's always been a PGA guy. I'll look into that. It might be. He would have been there for sure.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we're sitting there, and something come about golf course architecture, and I think I said something to Clates like, how do you deal with all these idiots talking about golf course architecture? He says, hey, I just don't talk to them. And Langer said, you talk to me? And Clay's quick as a flash just said, yeah, but not about golf course architecture. It was just the smoothest cutting off at the knees you'd ever encountered. Just whoosh, done. You wouldn't have even noticed until your legs fell off. Oh, wow, he's just cut off my knees there. Quite remarkable. And there's 1,000 of those stories with Clates. He is priceless. But I dearly love him as a friend, and I'm really proud that I think I can count him as a friend. But his contribution in golf is hugely important, I think. Hugely important.
Other than Clates, obviously, as a favourite guest, are there any others that jump out to you as favourites over the years?
I always enjoy Huggy because I often don't agree with his position on stuff. I never have the polar opposite thing, but he's always got a perspective that I sort of don't think of. So Huggy's always a great guest. He's a good talker. He's a curmudgeon, which is always fantastic. Just won the Nicholas Award.
Saw that, yeah.
And the fabulous thing about that, and I can't wait to tell him next time I talk to him, is it proves that award is not a popularity contest. Because if it was, Huggy wouldn't have won it. He's not in the business to make friends, which is what I love about Huggy. And so I think he's always good. He's got no interest in being friends with the players, which is as it should be, nor am I. If you happen to become friends with the players, so be it, but it's not your job. You have to write critically about these people, which can be difficult if they become friends. I think Clayton once wrote something about Geoff Ogle, which I thought was magnificent, because the two of them are fabulous. They're really firm friends. You know, there's a really great relationship between Ogilvy and Clayton. And Clayton had to write something. It wasn't critical, but wouldn't have been easy to write about a friend, and Clayton did it beautifully. Other guests that I really like, there's been so many. Whenever I'm talking to people, I find them the most interesting person in the world on the podcast. That sounds sort of cliche and nonsense, but it's not. Once we start to talk about a topic, I really get into it. My brain fires and starts to turn over. If you were to say to me before the interview, this is going to be amazing and interesting, I'll be like, really? I can't imagine what we're even going to talk about. But once you start to talk to people, that's when things get interesting. People are interesting. They always surprise you. Conversations always take turns that you don't expect. One of the things that, well, you'll probably listen, but cut this bit out for him only and let the rest of the audience hear. One of the things I really like about Logue is he's such an interesting and different thinker. He always says something which makes me stop and sit back and think. The classic one, we talked about the golf course at the Olympics. And his opening gambit for his sort of, about the golf course was, well, if you ask a child to draw a dog, what? Where is this going? And of course, he then makes the point that a child will draw something that, is quite obviously a dog to anyone who looks at it. He said, well, if you ask a child to draw a golf course, they draw something that looked like Kasuma Gaseki, I think it was called. The point being that it's just kind of not cookie cutter, but it's a very golf-looking sort of golf course, nothing architecturally outstanding. It was a brilliant way to make the point. But exactly that. You can't do anything but when he opens with, if you ask the child to draw a picture of a dog, it's like, what has this got to do with golf in the Olympics? But that's what appeals to me so much about Logue. He's a really interesting and deep thinker about stuff. So I probably enjoy doing the show with him as much as anything, the Good podcast, as much as the guests. Meg McLaren is clearly a favourite, both when she's been on Good, but I really enjoyed the chat I had with her on The Thing About Golf, which is a much longer form, one-on-one interview show. Even more than all of that, though, I've really enjoyed. Meg is one that I might consider not a close friend, but a friend. Professional golf has become sort of a friend because she's just such a thinker and an interesting young woman. We've had some great chats. She's been out to Australia quite a bit with the Ladies European Tour, and we always sort of catch up and sit down and have a coffee, and I DM with her on Twitter a bit. She's a really impressive young woman. I really enjoy just talking to her because she's intelligent, thoughtful, articulate, looks at things in a way that you maybe don't expect, and has taken on a role, probably partly accidentally, as sort of a champion of something that really does distract her attention from what it is she's trying to do, which is be the best golfer she can be. She's become this spokesperson for, it's calmed down these days, but for a year or two there, Meg McLaren was just like, she's the equal pay girl, because she'd sent out this one tweet at one point. But she took all that on. Her blogs are amazing. If you haven't read her writing, her review of the 2019 Masters when Tiger won, hands down the best review that I read about that tournament. It wasn't, journalistically, it didn't have all the who, what, when, where, how, and why. But as a piece of writing about that event and what unfolded, I sent it to Kari Webb recently, and she just sent back a note that just said, wow. She hadn't read it at the time. She just said, wow. And that's right. So Meg's special, a bit like Clayton. She has a special gift for writing as well as playing. So I always enjoy talking to her. I don't know. It's hard to have sort of favourites. But your favourite, it's a bit like Gary Player, when he sort of talked about love slow greens and then the next week I love fast greens. You've got to love whatever it is that you're doing that week, and you've got to love that guest, whoever it is that you've got on that week, to have a good, interesting sort of discussion with them. And we pick our guests fairly carefully. The worst kind of guest is the one who, as I'm proving not to be, just gives one-line responses or doesn't have much to say. It's why golf pros are often not great interviews. They're so careful about what they say publicly, and understandably so, that they end up saying nothing. And so we don't do much of that sort of stuff. But the issues I think we talk about are, and we never talk about how to fix your slice or stop three-putting. Or when you tell people that don't play golf, what do you do? I've got a golf podcast. Like, right, it's all about tips. And no, it's got nothing to do with any of that. It's about gender politics and golf's broader role in the community, why public golf is so important, and it's about all of those things, and why golf course architecture is important, why golf can be much more than just a game for so many people. Nothing to do with how to play it, because frankly none of us are qualified to make any comment about that. Even Clayton reckons he's not qualified to comment on people's golf swings, which I was staggered to hear when he revealed that on an episode once. So I don't know. Go and look, if people are interested, go and listen to all of the episodes. That's the best thing you can do. There wouldn't be more than, a couple hundred hours there, Shane?
The good news is that the iSeek back catalogue is still there on Spotify.
Is it? Oh, there you go. There's some really good stuff on there. Andrew Thompson we had on, he was fabulous. We had him on the iSeek Golf podcast. He would have been one of our last interviews on there, Peter Thompson's son. And he was fantastic. Really interesting to listen to. Who else did we did? We did a few in the iSeek days. We had Brandel Chambly. Yeah, we did have Brandel on there. And he's, Brandel's Brandel. He's a clearly intelligent bloke and he knows golf and whatnot, but I'm not in line with many of his views on some of I think what are the more important elements of the game. I find that you might have a thought about this. It feels to me like America particularly, it's such a big place. Things like space and how much room golf courses take up and the environmental impact of them just seems to wash over people in America. It's just, that's fine. There's plenty of space. Why wouldn't you have huge golf courses that were 8,000 yards long? What's the problem with that? The way Australia lives, all around the coast with this huge empty bit in the middle and, the urban environments, it just doesn't work here in Australia. I feel like we talk about the distance debate a lot, and that's part of it. At amateur golf level, the distance is a problem. 20 markers are hitting the ball further and further off the golf course than they ever used to, and it's an issue. I don't feel like a lot of people in America feel the same way. Maybe it's people who are into golf. They just feel like, that's fine, just build a bigger golf course. That's just not possible in a lot of places here in Australia, and I imagine the same is true for Ireland.
No, for sure. And, the improvement in technology is, in many places here, much like in some of your best golf courses. I mean, the golf course has been extended to not quite to the bar or the back wall, but pretty much
far off.
That far.
Not far off. There's
so I think the issue with not the issue, but in answering your question, most Americans think bigger is better, and they also don't see past their own borders. God love them, but I mean it's a big market, and all 300 or 400 million of them. So
there's
it's just a function.
There's a why would you element. It is there, and we in Australia often complain about this. Their players, they never travel, they never come to Australia and play. Well, I'll tell you what. If you took America and transposed it down here to Australia, none of our players would travel either. Why would you? If you had everything in America, why would you get on a plane and fly 24 hours to go and see a golf course on the other side of the world? What, is it going to be better than Augusta National? It might be as good, but so that tyranny of distance for Australia in particular, probably a little less so with Ireland, gives us a certain sort of an attitude. And it's very easy to be unfair on Americans. America is an amazing place, and Americans are amazing people. But it is the very best and the very worst of everything can be found in America in a way that I don't think you see in other places. It's, but there's a whole Korean golf tour of players who never travel either, and they don't have to. And if you don't have to, why would you? I do think we're a bit unfair sometimes on some of our American friends in the criticisms we make about them not being global players, because I really think it'd be very easy to just go, why would I? What's the need for me to travel beyond going over and playing the Open? Which they didn't do for a long time, as you well know. It was Arnie that sort of started all of that. So, America is a really interesting place outside of golf, and in terms of golf, it's an even perhaps more interesting place, because whether you like it or not, and we see this with LIV and the PGA Tour, and I understand and get all the complaints about people outside America, and I've been making those same complaints myself. I think the PGA Tour has a responsibility to have a more global view, but the truth is, it is the golf market. The DP World Tour could not achieve what the PGA Tour has achieved if they had the entire market to themselves, except America. It's not possible to do. That's where the money is. It's where the sponsorship dollars are. It's where the interest is. There has to be a peak place to play somewhere, and in golf it is always going to be America. Now, that doesn't mean that the PGA Tour doesn't have a responsibility to expand the game beyond its own borders, which they don't do enough of. But the reality is always going to be that American golf is going to be the most dominant golf.
But I mean, I guess we also forget that it's a members tour run by members, essentially.
Yeah, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, do they?
And going back to why would we? You know, like, we don't have to.
That's
so
right.
We're not.
That's right. And that's not. And look, that's not all players either. There's a lot of. I saw Zach Blair about 5 or 6 years ago down here playing in the Australian Open. No fanfare, nothing. Came to play in the Australian Open because he wanted to go and see courses on the sandbelt, because he had an interest in golf course architecture. There's a lot more of that than we probably give players credit for. But if you're in the top 15 players in the world, really, you think you've got some Royal Melbourne? I'm sure it's a great golf course, but no shortage of great golf courses that I can go and play an hour from home. Why is there a need for me to go to the other side of the world? I can sort of understand that, you know. Rory's becoming more that way, I think. We see less and less of, and we're going to see less and less of Rory outside the States with these designated events and the way that's unfolding. He's put himself in a position now of being the PGA Tour, as Logue would love to say, the titular head of the PGA Tour, and his commitments there are going to be enormous. It's going to be very. I mean, he's always been criticised, as you well know, for not playing enough at home. He's always done a reasonably good job of playing globally. He's been to Australia a few times, handsomely paid for it. Talked about coming here to play the Australian Open at Kingston Heath a couple of years ago because it was at Kingston Heath, which is to his enormous credit. Pandemic ruined that, so it never happened. But he wouldn't have done it altruistically. He's not going to come and play here for free. You'll have to pay him if you want him to play here. So there's lots of issues. But if you're at the top of the game, and the other thing is, there's so much, I imagine, goes on. I mean, Rory's his own industry, as is Adam Scott, as is Tiger. They're an industry unto themselves, and their responsibilities are to more than just what we think they should do. They've got entire staffs to pay and, you know, sponsors to serve and all of that sort of stuff. So I'm sure there's lots of stuff we don't understand about what goes on at the top of the game. But it's very easy to see the greed as well. And don't pretend that's not there.
You know, it's funny you were mentioning, you were commenting, why would you? That sort of gave me a bit of a flashback to something I was reading earlier on. Matt Goggin had a post up on LinkedIn with a new picture, I think, of the 1st or the 18th at 7 Mile Beach. He's that's going to be some venue.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Look, and what a contribution to the game. That's why I put him in I put him in that category of, you know, the Thompson, Clates, Matt Goggin, Jeff Ogilvy to an extent with his sort of talking and writing sort of on the game. That's a contribution way more than being a player. Even if Matt had won that Open that Stuart Sink went on to win, Matt played in the last group with Tom Watson that day, people forget. His contribution at 7 Mile Beach, and not just the course, all the time. He's been on your podcast. He's been on the Australian Golf Passport podcast. We've had him on the Thing About Golf, which was less about 7 Mile Beach and more about other stuff as well. But all the talk about it and the discussion and the insight into what makes him tick and what's made him want to do this project at 7 Mile Beach and the way he's doing it, hugely important to the game and hugely important to the game beyond the game. We trap ourselves in golf. We've got our own media, our own language. You could be a golf administrator and go an entire 30-year career and never speak to a reporter from outside a golf publication. That's a bubble that we live in. And there's a whole world outside of golf, and golf is starting to feel those pressures. We talk about it on Good a lot with public golf in particular. Lots of people have no interest in golf and, in fact, would rather see golf disappear. And we in golf, I don't think, really appreciate just how much of that there is and how precarious golf's position is. It needs to make its case, and Matt makes golf's case, and that's important.
Yeah, he's doing us some service.
He really is. And look, and for golfers, that golf course that's being built it looks just astonishing. I can't imagine it'll be anything but amazing to get. I might even pull out the clubs and go and have a hit at 7 Mile Beach at some.
Shock, horror.
It'll be ugly.
Doesn't matter.
Nobody will be allowed to take any pictures, but and then a little like Barnbougle Dunes and Richard Sattler and what happened there and how that unfolded with the 2 courses there. The contribution to golf is enormous, but the contribution beyond golf is equally important because Matt's doing what golf needs to do. He is engaging with the outside community. He is asking people to come in. He's not joking. He's going to have a rail outside the clubhouse where you can tie up your horse and come in and have a drink. There's a lot of horse riding goes on in that area, and that's what he wants. I think that's phenomenal. And I took great delight. Brandel Chamblee wrote something once about, advancement and how important it is. You don't tie your horse up outside the clubhouse anymore. And I took great delight in firing back a clip from the podcast where Matt Goggins said that's exactly what he intended to do and saying, well, actually, Brandel, which was cheeky of me, and I didn't get much of a response. But that's really important. If there was more of that in golf's position in society would be much safer. Much safer, but it's not safe. Not in lots of places around the world, including here in Australia. And even in Scotland, lots of public golf courses are getting closed, which is tragic.
You've written a bit about that. I know you're probably thinking somewhat along the lines of Northcote in Melbourne and Moore Park in Sydney.
Park, which is you'd be mad to look at that, whether you've got an interest in golf and say, oh, this is a business we should close down. That's effectively what some people are saying. Moore Park is one of the busiest golf courses, quite possibly in the world. Sun up to sundown, middle of Sydney. It's maybe 5 kilometres to the centre of the CBD of Sydney, and it's a completely public golf course with a 3-tiered driving range that is just constantly busy.
Essentially situated in Centennial Park, the park in
a couple of hundred hectares or whatever it is of parkland, which is completely surrounded by. And yet you have these otherwise intelligent people who, for whatever reason, have decided that golf is an easy target, and golf has made itself an easy target, to take potshots and say, why is that reserved for just the use of the few, and these sorts of specious arguments. And I've written a lot about that, and I've taken those arguments apart and all the rest of it, but I've only done that in the golf media. These things are being reported in the mainstream media. Clover Moore gets herself in the Sydney Morning Herald talking about it. I write a piece rebutting that. Well, guess what? The Sydney Morning Herald readers don't see that. Nikki Gemmell, who's a brilliant author, very successful author, sells lots of books. She decided to take a shot at golf for some reason one day, and it was the absurdity of the things she wrote. I just took it apart piece by piece. But again, her audience in The Australian, where her column appears, is both national and way, 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 way bigger than the people who read my column on Golf Australia, who are all golfers. So all the people reading her thing, lots of them are non-golfers, and they take those views on board and just go, oh, yeah, that's right, golf is for rich people. And she was saying stuff along the lines of, well, I don't care, they can have it out there in the suburbs, but, leave the city green space for us. And it's just really nonsensical stuff, and just as though everybody can afford to wander out to the suburbs to indulge their desire for golf. The thing about those arguments that really annoys me is it's almost saying kids who grow up in the city don't deserve the opportunity to try golf. Let's take it away from them so they can't even experience it. And that's whether you like golf or not. It's an industry, it's a legitimate industry, and we think there's lots of things about golf that are good, but how can you just say, you just deny people the chance to even experience it by just removing it from the urban landscape? That's just wrong. Anyway, don't get me started on that.
How can we rectify that? How can we do better, I suppose?
I wrestle with this constantly. We have to do better within the golf media so that the non-golfer who wanders into that space doesn't get attacked, and there's a lot of that. We do a lot of wrong stuff in golf. Somebody last year sometime, there was a woman who popped something up on Twitter, golf dash a game for the rich, which was clearly a troll and taking a shot. But the attacks on her, calling her an idiot, and then really getting personal, as happens on Twitter because it's a toxic cesspit, we know that. That doesn't help. Calling people that you don't agree with idiots and imbeciles and lefties and greenies and commies, and you get a lot of that in golf when these discussions come up. That there's a place for being somewhat combative when you're standing your ground at some point, but it shouldn't necessarily be your opening salvo. I mean, that's a line of thinking that says, well, violence is often the answer, so let's try it first. It's not the way you want to do that. I don't know what the answer is. I wrestle with it. First step is to be better within the golf media and try to educate golfers themselves about what it's going to come down to, really, for public golf, is golfers learning to share that space. Far too many golfers think about their local public golf course as their space. And if you're not playing golf, stay out of it. And that's just not going to fly. Whether you agree with that or not, pragmatically, that's not going to fly in the future. That's why I loved what the plan they came up with for at Northcote, Bill Jennings and the people he worked with, was fabulous. It was listen, we want to invite you in to share this with us, not stay away, you're going to get hit by a golf ball. You can't come anywhere near the place. There's been some awful things happen, golfers screaming at people who've inadvertently wandered onto a golf course, and we all understand where that comes from, but it doesn't help to get involved in that. So I don't know if there is, what the answer is. There's no golf writers left at mainstream daily newspapers anymore, as far as I can tell. So there's nobody within that environment speaking for the game, or very few. And I know how daily newspapers work. Man bites, dog sells. Royal Sydney here going through a restoration. Gill Hands, their DA called for a whole bunch of trees to be removed. It's easy fodder.
Whipping the trees out. Unbelievable.
Look at all these rich blokes up on the hill, men, mostly white men, all multimillionaires, just destroying the landscape so they can whack their little white ball around the field. It's easy.
I heard they were getting rid of all of that eastern suburbs Banksia scrub as well, burning it and getting rid of it.
They are doing that, but you don't read that. That's not a headline, Shane. And I get that. I worked in daily newspapers. And there is something to be said. You don't just let the members at Royal Sydney ride roughshod over the environment because they've got money. But by the same token, there is a responsibility to report fairly and objectively. And much of that gets lost. We have a media these days. If you're in the newspaper business, it's very hard to sell newspapers. So we've gone away from reporting the news in the bits of the paper that weren't about shouting to just having newspapers devoted to just shouting. And that's one of the problems that we have with golf. So whilst that's true, what they're doing, holding Royal Sydney to account, is important, but there's got to be, and this is what Matt Goggins said, I really liked what he said about this issue. He said, there are a number of people who are not engaging in the discussion in good faith. And that would make life so much better for everybody. If Clover Moore wanted to engage in the discussion about Moore Park Golf Course in good faith, you would get a much better outcome. I have invited her to come on the show several times on the podcast. I've sent her links to have a listen to the show, that we're not a shouty, gotcha, mad screaming at her, you crazy lefty woke. I'm not interested in any of that. The Venn diagram of what Clover Moore thinks about the world and what I think about the world overlaps in way more ways than it doesn't. But on this particular issue, a sensible discussion would be good. And she's not engaging in good faith, if I can put it that way. So she's just taken a position. She wants to push that position. And Matt Goggins right. When people aren't engaging in good faith, it makes it very, very difficult. Very difficult. So, and then you get into the world of politics, and my goodness, who wants to be part of that? That's madness.
But back in the dim, distant past, Rod, podcasting past, that is, you had something called the Book Club on both IC Golf and actually 2020, apparently. The 2nd of March 2020 was your last
Not
episode.
my life. Hey. Let me just distance myself from this completely.
Sorry.
That's exactly right.
Sorry, but that's it. No, that's it. So I've already made representations to him to no effect. So that the return of the book club on Good would be very welcome. I'm hoping that if I kick you, you might kick him.
I've kicked him a few times.
So I'm punching. I don't know if I'm punching down or punching up. I'm not quite sure. So as I said, just to let you both know, the last episode of this type was aired on the 2nd of March 2020.
It's almost an anniversary.
Almost
an anniversary, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, an episode no less on the World Atlas of Golf, which actually I would recommend people listening to.
Yeah, hosted ably by Derek Duncan, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So as I said, you might just pass the info on to Logue that your listenership has been waiting nearly 3 years to listen to the next episode of the book club. And in fact, he announced it.
Yeah.
Weathered and Simpsons.
Yep.
The architectural side
he
of golf.
ordered it.
Fucking 3 years later, and we're still waiting.
Not only mentioned it, he ordered the book, waited several weeks for it to arrive, insisted that the others he was going to have on the show do the same. And you're right, quite. Logue's a thinker, not a listener. You know, you can tell him what you like. He's not listening. I'd like to see it come back to, and I think he would too. Or as you well know, the thing about podcasting, this isn't hard, the sitting and talking into the microphones and listening on the headphones and having a discussion. This is the fun part of it. Organising all of that is time consuming, and it's more time consuming than people realise. I'm in the podcast business, and I can tell you that for a fact, that that's the part of it that's not so much fun. It's like the practice that the pros put in before they get to go out and have the joy of playing in the tournament, whatever it might be. So there's partly that. Now, if I'm not mistaken, we should share some of the blame around here. Did not Proctor and Jim Hartzell threaten to start a book club podcast? Whatever happened to that?
There was some talk.
Did they
about
do
that.
it? I think there's a space for it.
There's
a space for it.
Yeah. I haven't seen it yet. That's not to say that
there's not room for two.
That it hasn't. But look, maybe they're in beta testing. I'm not quite sure. I'd say Stephen is pretty thorough, if nothing else.
True, that's very true. He'd be researching microphones.
Hello, Stephen, if you're listening.
If you're listening, put it this way: I really enjoyed the episodes of that I did. I don't really have the time to do the book club episodes anymore, and I'd like Logue to do it, partly to be honest with you, because I think a bit more Logue wouldn't hurt. I'm not sure if he's. I think he worries a bit about the hosting gig as well. That wouldn't naturally be his thing. I don't know. He'll probably disagree with that if he hears this. I think they were really enjoyable. We always got fabulous feedback about it. And, well, we've kind of veered into this. This is one of the joys of podcasting as a medium, and this is a golf example of it. People think about podcasting as a broadcast industry. They think of Joe Rogan. How do I become Joe Rogan? Well, that's the same game everyone played in the 90s with trying to be Seinfeld. Hasn't changed at all. Podcasting is just a different delivery method. The beauty of podcasting is it can actually be the opposite of that. Now, there might only be 1,000 people in the world really interested in a book club podcast about golf books. But if you produce it and those people get joy out of it, it's worthwhile. The cost is not in money, it's in time. So you can create something that really enriches people's lives, including your own, for next to no financial cost, and it has a worthwhile and wonderful place to sit. I get people come through the studio here all the time, and Joe Rogan is the name that always comes up. Oh, we got this idea, we want to be like Joe Rogan. That's an age-old game of the media. It's got nothing to do with podcasting. The podcasting I'm interested in is small to medium businesses with not huge budgets, but for whom podcasting can actually really add something to their business. And that book club idea is a really good example of that, and how that you might be able to get a sponsor for a golf book club podcast from, I think Abe's Books used to do a lot of books, and I don't know whether they still do, but they might pay, I don't know, $100 an episode. They sell 3 books, they make $250. Do you see what I'm saying? You can do something valuable without a huge audience. That's what appeals to me about podcasting. I don't know how many people listen to this podcast, Shane. It doesn't really matter, but those that do are getting something out of it. I mean, you don't stumble across podcasts is the other thing. You need to seek them out and actively engage in downloading and listening to them. So as a form of media, they're much different to most others, I think, anyway. That's just off the rails. That was a little plug for my business, I guess, really, more than anything.
For sure. sydneypodcaststudios.com.au.
That's right. Very ordinary website. Yeah. Mention Firm and Fast for a 10% discount. I'm only kidding. You're not getting a 10% discount. Mention Firm and Fast all you like. You're not getting a 10% discount.
We just went off on a tangent there.
So one of the reasons I stopped playing golf also, by the way, was starting the studio. But work things changed a lot, and having your own business is, as I've discovered, it's a full-time gig and then some. There's not a lot of time and opportunity for golf when you run your own business.
You produce and edit various other people's podcasts as well, yeah?
Oh, way more than – I do more non-golf podcasts than golf. In fact, I co-host a podcast about wounds and wound dressings, Shane. That's exactly the correct response, but it's fabulous fun and it's work.
I don't want this to sound derogatory, but I'm assuming you might as well be looking into a hedge than that. You're obviously using a script.
I have a co-host who's a doctor.
Okay,
that's how it happened.
Okay.
She started as the host, and after a few episodes she said to me, I'm not coping with this being the host thing. I'm used to answering the questions. And then she looked at me and she said, would you co-host it? She's English. would you co-host it? And I said, well, for a fee, yeah. She said, oh, that won't be a problem. Okay, well, now I'm a co-host of The Wound Doctors, which works very much in the world that our mutual friend, Matt Molliker, who's a podiatrist, she's a podiatrist as well. And a lot of the discussion is about things that touch on podiatry. None of that to do with God. That'll have bored the golf audience census. But yes, it is a topic of some mirth around the place that I co-host a podcast. As I often say to my other half, I'm practically a doctor. I've got a medical podcast. I'm practically a doctor.
And
Golf.
obviously with all the co-hosting on the Wound show and the other golf stuff, do you have time to listen to podcasts? Are you a podcast listener?
I am. I do some recreational podcast listening. I do enough work podcast listening here at work. And what I tend to veer towards is comedy stuff, particularly English comedy. I listen to, some of your listeners might be familiar with Andy Zaltzman, hosts the news quiz on BBC Friday nights on Radio 4, I think it is over there. I listen to the news quiz, but he's got a whole network of podcasts under the banner of The Bugle, sort of political satire and whatnot. Fabulous show. Listen to that every week. Alice Fraser, who's part of that team, does a podcast called The Gargle, which is a similar sort of thing. So not much golf related. I do listen to Derek's show quite often. I listen to Firm and Fast most times. You're one of my cooking companions because it's a long podcast. So if I'm going to cook something and I'm going to be in the kitchen for an hour and a half doing that, in go the AirPods and I listen to it. But most of my podcast listening is work related. And the other thing that, a bit like golf, when you start working in it, you listen to podcasts differently as well. So I'll find things that annoy me if I'm listening to a podcast and I don't like the sound of this or the edit that's been made there. It's a bit too critical, not a great way to necessarily listen. But I do a bit. That tends to be the bulk of my podcast listening is sort of political satire. Because the UK is a clown show at the moment. It's just, wow. What's happened over there the last 5 or 6 years is just extraordinary.
Pass the parcel.
You had a Prime Minister that lasted 44 days.
Boris is on manoeuvres again,
I know.
in terms of trying to fly keeper.
Yeah. And look, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that he'll be back. Let's not go down that path. I'm sure the golf people aren't interested in any of that.
No, absolutely. Listen, yes. Let's get back to present day. We've recently had the first event of the Live Golf Series in Mayakoba, Mexico. Straight from the frying pan into the fire rod.
Yeah.
There are 2 more events in the USA this month, I think, and then they're off down to your neck of the woods, to the Grange Golf Club in Adelaide on the 21st to the 23rd of April. Looking at Liv's website, it appears that the Adelaide event is sold out, and tickets may indeed resemble hen's teeth.
Yeah.
There seems to be plenty of interest in the Live product from Australian golf fans.
There really is. I think Cam Smith has a lot to do with that, I suspect. He's kind of the man of the moment in world golf and certainly in Australian golf. He's a bit of an Australian golf hero at the moment. There's a mixture also of, there's an awful lot of anti-PGA Tour sentiment here in Australia. There's a real narrative in this that the PGA Tour ruined professional golf in this country. 15, 20 years ago, we had a schedule of tournaments, 10 or 15 pretty big tournaments. We've now got 2, the Australian Open and the PGA. And a lot of people blame the PGA Tour for that. The PGA Tour have had a role in that happening, but they haven't been completely responsible for that. I mean, part of the reality for Australian professional golf is we just can't afford it anymore. We've been priced out of the market. There are not corporations here who've got the sort of money required to put on a PGA Tour event. So there's an awful lot of that driving it. And interesting in the new, Australia is sports mad also, which helps. The weekend or the week that the Live Golf is on, that whole, I haven't looked into this completely, but there's a whole raft of, this is a South Australian government sort of project, is to bring people to South Australia for events. So around that time, there's an entire round of the AFL where every game will be played in Adelaide. They also have, I think it's called WOME Adelaide, is a music festival. There's a comedy festival. Now, I'm not sure if all of these things are around the same time, but they're building these events where you go for the golf, but you can also go to the music and you can go to this or to an AFL game. So there's an element of that. But yeah, look, I'm a bit surprised. I mean, they're saying it's sold out. I don't know how many tickets they had, but I come across people quite often who are really pro-Live. I find it surprising personally. It does that I'm be indifferent towards, but pro-Live seems an interesting position to me to take. But a lot of it, I feel, is sort of anti-PGA Tour. There's a really strong sense of anti-PGA Tour here in Australia. amongst golf fans. I do think that Live has also, they've had some success in convincing people who might not otherwise be interested in golf to go and have a look. Because it's not just golf, there's music, and I don't think they're actually doing anything innovative. That doesn't mean that you can't market the notion that you're doing something innovative and convince people of it. So, yeah, look, I'll be really interested to see, you know, I can't assume they've made that up. If they're saying it's sold out, you've got to assume that it's sold out. You have to take them at their word, which is interesting.
No, I actually went on the website, and you can't
buy a ticket.
That's what it says anyway.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, the contrast between, I think, and forgive me if I'm incorrect in saying this, I think the South Australian government paid Live to bring them to Adelaide.
Oh, no question they
because
would.
there was a competition.
Yeah, no question they would.
And yet the contrast is they have difficulty finding half decent golf clubs to bring Live to in the States.
Well, two different markets, obviously.
Of course.
The truth of professional golf in Australia for the last couple of decades is it has been paid for by governments, and I don't see that as a sustainable situation. The President's Cup has always been funded essentially by the Victorian government. In fact, even Tiger's visit here in 2009, the famous one that you mentioned, to the Masters just before his world fell apart, all of that paid for by government money. It's not paid for by private money in Australia. There's no corporations that have got the sort of cash to splash around in that way, or they certainly wouldn't choose to do it on a one. I mean, golf's problem as a sponsored event, this is what Live's done to change golf. This will be the ultimate thing. We're seeing it with the designated events. We're going to go from a sport of independent contractors, which brings loads of problem if you're in the tournament organising and running space or TV, and you can't guarantee your stars, which you can't in golf as things stand, then you've got nothing. Even to the point of, okay, you pay Rory to come and play the Australian Open. Well, if he misses the cut, he misses the cut. There's nothing you can do about that. You can give half the money back, or you can have whatever arrangement you like in place. But Saturday, Sunday, he's not there. And the tournament suffers. And golf has always suffered from this, particularly outside America. And it was McGinley who said it to John Huggan on the Thing About Golf podcast. That's the biggest change that Live will make to professional golf. In the future, it will no longer be an independent contractor sport. You don't eat what you kill. You'll be a paid contractor like a footballer. You'll have a guaranteed income, and that's what these designated events that the PGA Tour is now talking about with no cut and all those sorts of things, that's where that is ultimately heading. And look, as polar opposite to what we think of professional golf and has always thought of professional golf as being, you can see the sense in that as a product to take to market. And that's different to golf and the things that we love about it. But as McGinley said, if a sponsor came to the European Tour board and said, listen, we've got $50 million, we want to put on a tournament, will Rory play? The only answer you can give is maybe. We don't know. We'll ask him. And the sponsor with $50 million says, well, I'm going to give you $50 million. You're not even going to guarantee Rory's going to be there? I'm going to take my $50 million and put it into something else. That's a genuine problem for golf. And that's what this sort of idea solves. Now, whenever you gain something, you lose something. Golf loses something through that as well. Do you end up losing Bob May versus Tiger at the PGA? Tiger versus Rocco at the US Open? Well, you don't at those tournaments, obviously. But do you lose some of those storylines week in and week out? I mean, there's too much golf is the main problem. There's too much golf and too many golfers. But markets are driven by demand, not supply. And if the demand is there for it, and the PGA Tour keeps finding people with the money to stump up and sponsor these things, well, that tells you that the demand must be there for it. They'll keep putting it on. So, look, this will be there's going to be seismic shifts in professional golf for the next 5 years, I think. And I think where it'll end up is something that much more resembles, if we're lucky, it'll resemble F1 and MotoGP, where the whole travelling circus picks up and moves from one venue to the next every couple of weeks, and the very best players, injury aside, are always on show. And we'll end up with one event in Australia. You'll probably get 2 events in the UK. One might be in Ireland from time to time, one in South Africa, one in Japan, and 10, 15 in America, because that's where the numbers are. That's what I think will happen with golf, and the players will be basically it's the Premier Golf League idea. I mean, if the PGA Tour had just gone with that, we wouldn't have this huge schism in the game with Live and what's happened there. I don't feel like Live is feasible. I don't think they're doing that. I don't think that's sort of their goal. And they don't have the names to do it. I don't see them getting them. It's not impossible, I suppose, but my argument's always been two arguments. If you think the PGA Tour have been bad stewards of the game, and they have, don't kid yourself that LIV is somehow going to be better. This is not an altruistic exercise for them. They're not doing this for the good of the game or for the joy of Australian fans to be able to go and see Cam Smith, which they can't because the PGA Tour doesn't come here. And the PGA Tour can be fixed. I don't know if that's true of LIV Golf in terms of the issues around, it always comes back to that very issue. You can hear the whataboutery already, but the source of the money. And the truth is, if you sign with LIV as a player, you sign to become a direct employee of the Saudi Arabian regime. And if you sign on to work with the LIV Tour, that's what you sign on for. And that's different to governments being involved in dealings with them. And it's a decision at a personal level. You can make those decisions. That's for people to decide themselves. I wouldn't do it. But lots have. But no doubt, I don't know why people seem to think this is so surprising. There's no doubt that all the changes we're seeing on the PGA Tour have been driven by the emergence of LIV. There was no reason for the PGA Tour. Why would you fix something that not only isn't broken, but can't be broken except by something as irrational as LIV Golf coming along? If you'd suggested 10 years ago in a PGA Tour board meeting, we better make some changes because one day there might be an oil state decide they want to take over golf and they might dip into their fund and pull out a couple of $1 billion to do it. If you'd suggested that in a PGA Tour meeting, you would have been rightly laughed out of the room, as if that could ever happen. Yet that's exactly what's happened. So there's no surprise they've been caught off guard. They've been the alpha dog for forever, and there was no indication they weren't going to be the alpha dog anymore, and yet here we are. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens. But at the end of all of this, just always remember, professional golf isn't golf. It's only a small part of golf. We write a lot about it, and it occupies more space than it probably should in our discussions and thinking and writings and whatnot, but it's really a tiny part of golf. The guys out there this morning, standing on the tee now, about to hit their provisional because they're not sure if it went out or not, the fence on the right of the first at Mangrove Mountain, that's golf. Much more so than professional golf.
With the LIV stuff, I'm not a huge fan, a real fan of LIV, but that doesn't mean I'm a PGA Tour fan either.
No, which is all too often the assumption. You apparently you're not allowed to be anti-LIV and anti-PGA Tour. It's that if you're not with us, you're against us. The old Hitler line. It just makes everything binary, which is just stupid, really stupid. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
Have you watched any of it?
I think I watched like half an hour or something of one of the first 3 or 4 events last year. To be fair, I don't watch a lot of golf anymore either. I do watch some, but not a lot. And my takeaway was this doesn't look any different, really. It's guys playing golf and guys you've seen playing golf before. I mean, I couldn't see any discernible difference between it and the PGA Tour. Certainly for the casual viewer. Dustin Johnson was playing golf. Well, last year Dustin Johnson was playing golf too, just on the PGA Tour. So the product itself. Now, if they wanted to innovate and create a mixed teams competition or do something really interesting with women and men and juniors, something like the TPS but on a grander scale, they'd have my attention. But there's a lot of faux innovation. Well, we let our players wear shorts. Well, okay, great. We only play for 3 days. Okay. We've got music on the venue. Okay. None of it's innovating. The product itself, the base product, is golf. And there's a real fear in golf that that's not enough to hold people's attention. There's been a long period of golf marketing where, governing bodies and PGAs have tried to market everything but the golf. It's almost like golf itself is toxic and you've got to be about everything except golf. And I think that's dangerous and does the game a disservice.
Just to that point, Rod, do you think Golf Australia, with their new approach to the Australian Open in 2022, covered that brief?
It's at least innovative. I'm in two minds about whether it's appropriate for national opens.
Maybe just to explain to people that perhaps aren't aware of the format that they tried to show.
They had a, what do we call it? Like the Vic Open. The men and the women both played over 2 courses, all 4 days. 2 separate trophies, 2 separate titles, but in a mixed field, which, by the way, is my preference for the mixed events that are of any importance. The European Tour event that Lynn Grant won last year, for example. I'm not so much in favour of that, the same sort of thing that the Sandbelt Invitational does. I just don't think there's an ideal way to deal with the disparity, particularly in distance and styles of game between men and women, to have them play for the same purse, which is not to say it shouldn't happen. Right? There's a certain level of tournament where it's fine for the Sandbelt Invitational, but for let's call it a proper tour event, I'm not so convinced. But that's not the in or there, and I might change my mind about that one day, I'm not sure. But the Australian Open model, where the men's and women's Australian Open happen concurrently, is the word I was looking for. Thanks for not helping me out there, like the Vic Open. It's at least innovative. There was a lot of issues around. There are logistical issues about not only putting the tournament on with 2 courses, et cetera, and in Sydney that's going to be, the 2 courses are a couple of k's apart. And anyway, that's going to be all sorts of issues around that. Logistically, in terms of getting players for both of those fields, because of the way internationally the women's schedule works versus the men's schedule, there's not really a right time for all of those players to be involved. Actually,
traditionally the women's was February.
February, yeah, that would start the year. There's issues about that for the men's fields. By then, guys from Australia have gone off overseas to try and get their tour cards there, so there's issues about that. There's issues about that whether you have it concurrently or not. So that's part of it. But the one thing, the overriding thing, which will decide this, is something that James Sutherland told us on the Good podcast. We had a whole episode of Good, sort of devoted to everything that kind of didn't work about the 2022 event, which was maybe a bit cheeky of us. But he wanted to come on the next week and rebut some of that, which he did. The point that he made that I think was by far the most important and people really need to listen to is this. The sponsorship market wants mixed tournaments. It ticks some social boxes for them as sponsors. Selling the men's Australian Open and the women's Australian Open as separate events means you may not actually be able to sell the men's and women's Open as Australian events. The marketplace wants the game to showcase the ability, which it can do for both men and women, to share the stage at the same time. And ultimately, that's what will drive that decision. They have committed to it. It's going to be this way for the foreseeable future. It's now up to them to make it work. It's a big, bold move that they've made. I don't know their reasoning for making it in the first place. My instinct is it may have been a little bit of a hurried decision. They got a lot of accolades for it when they made the announcement, which they would have loved. They got a lot of great feedback about the tournament itself from people who watched on TV overseas. That doesn't mean that there are not issues about it going forward. So, look, we'll see. But the fact that the market wants that will be a huge dictator of what happens and whether that concept survives. I'm not sure as I said, and I'm not sure. I think a national open is maybe more important than that. I think I'm somewhat in agreement with Scott Hend, who got ripped for suggesting that he wasn't going to play the event because he didn't agree with the format. But his point was he thinks the men's Australian Open and the women's Australian Open both deserve their own weeks. And there's merit in that, I think.
There is, but if the commercials don't add
That's
up
right.
and the sponsors aren't there for
That's
it.
exactly right. People assume that there'll be an Australian Open, a men's Australian Open, if we went back to it. The truth is there wouldn't have been an Australian Women's Open. It would have been back in the wilderness had it not been done this way. People assume that the men's Australian Open is not under any threat. Don't kid yourselves, people. There's no guarantees that somebody would step up to sponsor a men's-only Australian Open. No guarantees at all.
It was co-hosted at Victoria and Kingston Heath, right?
Yes, which is probably what, in inverted commas, saved it this year was 2 extraordinary venues, magnificent golf courses, and they really let the golf shine. It was fantastic. We mustn't forget the All Abilities were a part of that as well, which is hugely important. But that's a side discussion about something different, I think.
You were on the ground yourself in attendance.
I was on the ground in attendance. I didn't get to go out on the course very much. I tended to spend most of my time in the media centre, something I've criticised other journos for years and years and years. But for all sorts of reasons, I didn't get to go out and watch a whole lot of golf. Pardon me. I actually did my thing about golf interview with Mary Thompson that week, Peter Thompson's wife, which was fabulous. What a woman. So I had a few other things boiling away. I think there's a case to be made for the Australian Open to be permanently in Melbourne, or certainly for a period of time that lets it rebuild. It's in trouble, the Australian Open. the one thing Australia has that the golf world wants is the sandbelt. And we locked the Australian Open into Sydney for 15 years. And I'm not sure how sensible that was. I understand why. The major sponsor, the government tipped in a bunch of money. The major sponsor only flew out of Sydney at the time, Emirates. That was where their big international. They didn't want to be necessarily hosting a golf tournament in a city where they didn't fly from it. For all those reasons, you can understand all of that. They're all pragmatic. But if you look at golf and what the golf world wants, you put any event on the sandbelt and people around the world tune in. I'm not sure we pay that enough attention. I know it's difficult to juggle, but I'm not sure if we pay that enough attention. We could build. The Vic Open is a fabulous example of letting something organically build. It started in 2012 in suburban Melbourne at Woodlands and Spring Valley, from memory. That first year had its issues with that. They moved to 13th Beach, regional area. Lots of people would have said, I'm never going to work an hour and a half out of the city. That's madness, Nobody's going to turn up. Well, 7 years later, co-sanctioned with the LPGA and the European Tour. Because you didn't just chase that immediate success. That tournament built. And had it not been for the pandemic, it was probably about to become in some ways a victim of its own success because they were facing an issue of it's kind of gotten to a point where can we still stay at 13th Beach? But all of that aside, they're all good problems to have. The Australian Open maybe needs to go into a phase of that, I think, where if we said, right, we're going to do 10 years on the sandbelt, you've got the golf world on board now after 10 years. The Australian Open gets some of its cachet back, and then the title itself can carry the event, moving it around to lesser courses is the wrong way to put it, but do you know what I mean? To places that aren't as high profile as the Melbourne Sandbelt. I think there's merit in that, but I could be wrong.
You follow a good deal in the local pro and amateur scene there in Australia. For international listeners, who should we be watching out for over the coming years from Australia and New Zealand as well?
I won't pretend to be an expert. I certainly don't follow it as closely as I used to. There's one young guy down here, still an amateur at the moment, called Jeffrey Guan, who looks to be as good a player at this age. I mean, he's been finishing top 10 in professional events down here. Now, they're not the majors, but he's been finishing top 10 in professional events.
He won quite a few of Porter's Adidas series.
He did indeed. Ewan Porter has huge raps on him, and he's a pretty good judge, Ewan. He knows what a good golf game looks like. He's the one, to me, that stands out. We've got a couple of young professionals who, David Micheluzzi is one. He'll be playing Europe next year, or the DP World Tour, who's a fabulous talent. Had a bit of time in the wilderness. The pandemic really hurt a lot of the guys here in Australia. They just had almost no options. Elvis Smiley, who Clayton's caddies for, he's an extraordinary talent and a really exciting golfer to watch, which is a real bonus, I think. I'm trying to think, sort of amongst the women. Stephanie Bunke has a fabulous golf swing. Doesn't play as well as she should, it would seem, at this stage. We've got less good women players than we probably should have here in Australia. Kirsten Rudgley actually is one from WA, who's now on the Ladies European Tour, who's a seriously good player. There's another young girl called Justice Bozio who will play in the Augusta National Women's Amateur this year, who has had some real highlight moments and rounds this year in some of the TPS events. For those who don't know what the TPS events, it's a series of events called the Players Series that's been developed by the PGA down here. Men, women and elite amateurs and juniors all in the same fields playing together. So they put the juniors, the leader of the junior event, in the final group on Sunday with the pros that are leading the tournament. And they've just been fabulous. They tick all the boxes. It's great for the players. The competition is fantastic. They're playing in regional parts of Australia quite often, which is fantastic. It's where the golf should be going. It's on TV every week now here in Australia, so you can spend your Sunday afternoon getting to know players like Micheluzzi, Brett Coletta, Stephanie Bunke, Justice Bozio, which we haven't been able to do here in Australia for a long time because the golf just wasn't on. There wasn't golf on to be on the TV. So even though it's lower level golf, it's golf to watch and get familiar with these people and the storylines building. Okay, I saw that guy last week. Oh, that Laurie Flint, didn't he shoot 60 at Bonnie Doon? And here he is. He's bobbed up again on the leaderboard here at the New Zealand Open. So there's a lot of really good things happening with that. And that's, I think, a fabulous example of that organic growth. That was an idea kind of born out of Ogilvy and Clates during the pandemic. They had a bunch of these things. They just called it the game.
Yeah.
And that's what they did.
Yeah.
Hey, who's a good player? Doesn't matter whether you're a junior, an amateur, a man, woman. Who's a good player? right, there's a bunch of us good players. Let's go to Victoria and have a bit of a money match between us, and then sit around afterwards in the bar and talk about golf, and Geoff can tell you how he won the US Open and what's involved in being on the PGA Tour. Those experiences for those players, you can't buy. Not just the playing, there's the watching Geoff Ogilvy up close. You know, he still hits some extraordinary golf shots. He's playing quite well actually this week in Puerto Rico. If I saw,
he was it was that last week he was on the leaderboard early as
Pebble
well.
Beach, he played pretty well. So there's a bit of fight in the old dog yet. Well, for a 19, 20, 21-year-old kid who's just turned pro, and that's a whole world that you wander into there that's got nothing to do with everything you've ever seen before. That's priceless. To be able to spend a couple of hours with Geoff Ogilvy and then to listen to him talk about what's involved in being a touring pro. The TPS, I'm the first one to kick the PGA and Golf Australia and administrators when they get things wrong. You need to be the first to give them a huge shout out when they get it right. And this TPS series has absolutely got it right. I cannot find a fault with it. I really can't.
Wasn't it two of the boys in Golf Australia came up with the idea, yeah?
I'm not sure. I think it might have been the PGA. I'm not sure.
PGA.
Doesn't really matter. I mean, they're nameless and faceless when you criticise them, so they can be nameless and faceless when we give them a bouquet as well. I think Nick Dasty and Kim Felton were really instrumental in bringing it along. And
they're the two names I was thinking
they're
of,
they're at the PGA. So two really lovely guys.
Beg your pardon. Sorry, boys, if you're listening.
listening.
I beg your pardon, misidentifying you. You know, funnily enough, in terms of people from Australia to be watching out for, somebody that came via Australia, a blast from the past. The 2015 PGA Championship winner Jason Day seems to be back. Doesn't get home very much, but his back appears to be better, or certainly a little bit more fixed.
Feel like it's to me, and I've not followed it closely. It feels to me more like his attitude's better. I think something happens when you really reach the top of the tree, and particularly a tree that's as difficult to climb as the world golf and to become the world number one and all that sort of stuff. It's one of the most amazing things about Tiger. He just kept getting up and doing it every day. He never seemed to have any questions about what it is or he was just driven constantly. The nonsense that comes with it. There's got to be a point, Shane, where you've made so much money. What's motivating you? If I'd made $2 million in my life by now, I would not go to work. Do you know what I mean? Well, $2 million is not the figure. Do you know what I mean? If I had $10 million in the bank, you wouldn't find me at work. I'd not be motivated to do anything but sit around and enjoy my money. That's not how these people are wired. It feels to me, there's no question Jason had some physical issues with his back and whatnot, but when he was at the very top of world golf, he had a certain attitude and a certain way of being. I'll never forget Mark Leishman telling me this. I interviewed Mark Leishman. I said, there'd be a lot of people who'd say, Leish, that you've kind of underachieved. And he said, that might be true. He said, but people don't really appreciate what's involved in getting to the top of the mountain. He said, I've been at barbecues with Jason when he was the world number one. And, somebody's offered him a second beer and he said no. And Leish said to me, I'm not that guy. I want to have the second beer. I'm just not prepared to give it all up to get there. Jason was. Rory is. Tiger is. There's nothing wrong with being Mark Leishman and wanting a second beer. It doesn't mean you're going to have 100 beers, but that's the lengths these guys go to get there. And the other thing is the lines are so fine at that end of the game. I mean, you're talking 10 shots over the course of the year. 10 shots over the course of a year of tournaments could be the difference between being the world number one and the world number 25, 30, 40, 50. It's an incredibly difficult game. We've been spoiled by Tiger and the likes of Annika and Lydia Ko into not realising just how hard the game is outside of those super special echelons of play. And they really are. They're super special. I was thinking about this the other day. Lydia Ko won the Canadian Open at the age of 15 with 19 of the world's top 20 ranked players in the field. Think about that. A schoolgirl from suburban New Zealand beat 19 of the world's top 20 players. And we, like we have been with Tiger, for years it just becomes a ho-hum. Well, yeah, of course, you just expect that. It really, it does a disservice to the extraordinary achievement. And here she is, 12 years later, still sort of at the top of the game. So, yes, I see some really good consistent play from Jason, which suggests to me that, yes, I do think he's sort of on the way. Will he get back to number one? Don't know. There are very few players. I think Harrington said it best on, whose podcast was he on? Might have been on Thing About Golf with Huggy, and he said, players get sort of a 3-year window. It's a really interesting theory. You go back and have a look. He said, apart from the true greats, most players will get a 3-year window. Harrington had his own 3-year window. where that's you make hay while the sun shines.
He was talking about that tipping point between naivety and experience. And if you know too much, you know too much. That you can never get back from
That's
that.
right.
And there's something... You're almost better off not knowing than knowing.
Yes, of course. And that's what happens. You get to number one and you find out. It's what happened to David Duval, wasn't it? He won the Open and he went, is this it? I was kind of expecting something else.
The chase is more fun.
Yeah, exactly. And so, that which is, again, what makes Tiger so extraordinary. And people were staggered when they read in Hank Haney's book that, when Tiger won after he was married, and the first major he won after that, Neelan was like, well, hey, let's go and party. Jesper always partied if he won a tournament. And Woods just said, we don't do that. This is what we're supposed to do. Get on the plane. We're going home. There's a sadness about it. Are they getting the joy of that, of what they've achieved? I don't know. But we've been spoiled by Tiger in particular in this game. To do what he's done in this game is just, we should be dropping our jaws constantly in memory of what he's done and what he's achieved. You won't see the likes of it again, not in our lifetime, I don't.
Certainly, John Rahm's doing a pretty good impersonation the last couple of weeks.
The last couple of weeks, yeah, that's right. Last couple of weeks. Rory's done very good impersonations for periods of months at a time, as has Jordan Spieth. None of them have done 15 years of it. Yeah. That's what he did.
You'd ram in your crosshairs there recently.
I get it. If you've spent all your time and all your energy and a whole lot of time in the gym getting as long as you possibly can, hitting the golf ball as long as you can, it'd be easy to lose sight of the big picture, especially if you play golf for a living. You don't expect golf pros to have a particularly large prism of viewing the game through, necessarily, because they're immersed completely in it and they're in that competitive mindset of they've got to win. But yeah, he said some things about, how far the ball goes and that's all fine, which I just don't agree with. I think it is a genuinely huge issue for the game, and it taps into every aspect, not just professional golf. You know what? If they want to just take all the rules away, let professional golfers do it, fine, do that. Make a game that, it already in no way resembles what's going on at Mangrove Mountain on Saturday.
Free show.
Yeah, that's right. If you want to do that, do that. That's okay. I wouldn't be interested in watching it, but that's fine.
And while you're at it, take some performance-enhancing drugs. You should just let it all hang out there.
We wouldn't be the first to recommend, why don't they just have a drug Olympics? Let them see what they can do. Let them go. Why not? Why not? And there's an element of that.
Blinky the three-eyed fish.
Yeah, that's right. Straight out of The Simpsons. Yeah, exactly. But for the game more broadly, there are guys hitting it on the road up there at Mangrove Mountain today who couldn't have done that 15 years ago. And that's going to keep happening, and that's an issue. So that's going to be an issue for Mangrove Mountain Golf Club at some point. It's got nothing to do with John Rahm and whether he wins this week or, his strokes gained or this, that, or the other. That's all he's thinking about, and I get that. I understand. But it doesn't mean that his opinion has any great weight beyond professional golf. The whole point of the column was, how much should we listen to professional golfers about some of these issues that aren't about how to play the game really well? Because that's really all they can do.
We shouldn't, but in general, people probably do because they don't maybe have... They kind of assume that John Rahm knows more about golf than they do.
Which is why at some point in his career he'll probably get hired to design a golf course because he's John Rahm, and we've seen a lot of that. So it brings us almost full circle back to appreciating the Mike Claytons, Matt Goggins, Peter Thompson especially, of the world. Because they are professional golfers who understand the game well beyond that. And Thompson in particular, a 5-time Open champion, his wonderfully simple takes on the game beyond professional golf are hugely important, I think.
Yeah, time to plug that book. What's it called? Steve?
Well, hang on. It's a hey. Thank you very much. In fact, you better. We'll come to that.
As a self-confessed golf tragic, as I we touched upon very briefly earlier on, I understand that you don't play any golf anymore. It's not an indelicate question, I'm sure listeners are wondering why not.
Predominantly, this business. Now it takes all my time, but I think I might have been looking for something. I lost a bunch of the joy of playing the game. I got a horrendous case of the chipping hips, which is humiliating, embarrassing, and really takes a lot of fun out of the game. You don't have much. I was never any good. I could never play any. I think the best handicap I ever had might have been something like 10. So could never play. And when you start to lose the joy of actually playing, there's a real element of and I get this for people who don't, and there are people who just don't like. I was like, why am I paying to do this? What is the point? And so when you don't enjoy it, and look, I'm not saying that I'll never go back and play again. I may or I may not. I'm not sure. I can tell you that I'm a lot older and a lot less flexible than I used to be when I did play and I stopped. But that's the main reason. And in conjunction with that, I've found something else that takes my time, and it's this business and building a business. And so even if I hadn't sort of stopped playing, I would be in a position of not being able to play anywhere near as much as I wanted to, because I simply don't get the opportunities with doing what I'm doing. So they kind of went hand in hand. But the true answer is the yips.
You need to get stuck into some, what's his name? Carl Morris has a whole CD for people that had that particular. It's more the putting yips than the chipping yips, but I guess it's the same thing in terms of. Look, I'm not a sports psychology expert, but he does have one.
I interviewed him on the thing about golf. Fantastic. I will just say this though. That's not what necessarily keeps me out of the game. I think I probably would have gone a period where I stopped playing because of that, but then I would have been drawn back to it. I genuinely don't feel any great desire to go back and play at the moment. I may do one day, but and it's not the chipping route. I did a bunch of chipping at my old studio where I had a long hallway, and I think I may have even cured that. I don't know. Uh-huh. But that's not what keeps me out of the game. That's what saw me probably stop, but it's not what's kept me from playing. It would be unfair to suggest that. So,
given your last answer, this next question may be a little redundant. However, it is a recurring penultimate question, as you know. And assuming that you were still playing golf or perhaps go back to playing golf, what 5 courses are on your bucket list and why have you put them there?
I'd love to play the composite course at Royal Melbourne, because there's something about the opportunity to play a tournament course, which I think is special, and particularly a special golf course like Royal Melbourne. I've played the West course at Royal Melbourne. I haven't played the East. But I'd love to play it in that configuration of the composite course, and partly because not a lot of people get to do it, so it would be a bit special, wouldn't it? I mean, it's a tournament venue, really. It's not. I don't care which iteration of the composite course it is, by the way. If people are going to start riding in, and do you want the Australian Open or the President's Cup of this year or that, don't care which composite it is.
Or the original one, indeed, back from 1960, whatever it was.
Yeah, exactly. Because Royal Melbourne, to me, a bit like St Andrews, is a special place. It's spiritual. Every time I go to Royal Melbourne, I feel something almost physiological. It really is a very special place.
Do you think that's the spirit of Mackenzie and Morecambe and Crockford and Russell?
Probably in some way, but I can follow and have followed high handicap golfers around Royal Melbourne, watching them play in an event, and enjoyed it almost as much, not quite as much, as following Tiger around there in the President's Cup in 2019, which might be one of the most special things I've ever seen. Because the course, this is almost unheard of, but it doesn't matter the golfer or the level of the golfer. It asks them questions appropriate to them that make the game interesting, both to play and to watch. I could play Royal Melbourne with the yips because I'd never need to chip. There's no need to. There's always an option. I could always putt it from 40 yards off the green, or do you know what I mean? So it asks every golfer, it doesn't matter who you are, every question. I love Clayton's idea that if you're a good player, it's the hardest course in the world to shoot 65 and the easiest to shoot 75. Not the easiest. It's incredibly easy to shoot even par around Royal Melbourne, but it's incredibly hard to go under par. It's an incredible place. It's almost like a Bermuda Triangle. Something happens to golf at Royal Melbourne and it just changes for everybody. So Royal Melbourne composite course would be there. As I said, I played the West course and it was fantastic, but the composite would be something special. Uh-huh. 7 Mile Beach is on that list, even though it's not finished yet, because I think that will be something special. And again, it's not just the golf. I think what Matt's and the team are building down there, the golf course is going to be amazing, but the golf facility and its place and everything is going to be even more so.
I think he's a gentle soul, and I think the 7 Mile Beach ethos is just going to be just chill,
Yeah. You want to take on some hard shots? There's some hard shots here. You don't want to take them on? Don't take them on. There's no problem. No, putt it. Some days
don't mind the horse there outside the clubhouse.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Royal County Down. Uh-huh. I have forever regretted that we didn't get up north in Ireland to play there, and seen the pictures, the videos, heard people talk about it. Pardon me, you'd be mad not to have Royal County down on your bucket list. Macrahanish, if only just to play the first tee shot. There are very few courses in the world, I think, that have such a famous single shot.
It's the Cape shot, yeah?
It's a Cape shot, but everything I've seen of it, everybody who's been there talks about it.
It's essentially across the beach to the fairway, and you can cut off as much of the beach as you want.
That's exactly right, or as much. Yeah. You can try to cut off as much of the beach as you want. I'm not sure how that goes for most people. Is that 4?
That is 4.
4?
But again, it's a loose 5, right?
It's a loose 5. I'll tell you this, I won't get to 6, but interestingly, I do not have a desire to play Augusta National. I don't know why. I have mixed feelings about Augusta and the whole tournament. I love the tournament, but there's a lot of stuff about that.
Ron Morissette did say that Royal Melbourne is the golf course that Augusta wants to be.
Wants to be, yeah. And certainly when I was at the Asia Pacific Amateur there in 2014 and there was a lot of Augusta members around, the look in their eyes suggested he might not have been too far off the truth. They were pretty impressed with the place. I think, if you're a golfer and you don't want to play at least the 16th hole at Cypress Point, you're probably doing it wrong. So I'd put Cypress Point there at number 5. It looks to me like the term I fell in love with, it might have even been in Thompson's book a few years ago, which is sporty golf. No, it might have been in Robert Hunter's book. Sporty. Cypress Point looks sporty to me.
Yeah.
I love that notion.
You interviewed Christine Fraser recently and brought sporty golf up. I don't think she really understood what you were talking about.
No, she didn't. And if I had the chance to do that interview again, I would do it differently. I watched a thing yesterday. I don't know whether you saw it, a video with her that Schwab put out for some reason. Really interesting stuff. And it dawned on me, which it didn't when I was talking to her, and I've spoken to her more than once. We've interviewed her more than once, but it really did dawn on me. In fact, this is going to come out wrong. She's actually got very little interest in golf course architecture in a sense. She's much more interested in a much bigger picture of golf. And so the details of penal golf versus strategic golf are, not that she doesn't understand, I just don't think she's into it. And she doesn't like the conversation to stray down that way because it's too narrow. Even golfers, lots of golfers don't care about that sort of stuff. So she's remarkable. But yes, I don't think she twigged to what I thought the point I was making about sporty golf. But I think most golfers do. We've all played a golf course where you can feel it. It's sporty. A lot of the golf in Ireland I find is very sporty. Big dunes and those kinds of things. There's one of the things Royal Melbourne's got is just scale. It's grand. It's this grand sweeping venue. And you have a reaction to it, I think. That's where the sporty comes from.
Right, there are your 5. A fine collection of 5, it must be said. So,
we're very lucky in golf. There are so many places you could choose from. There's 100 other courses you could pick from, isn't there, really?
And there's no wrong answer.
That's exactly right. There's no wrong answer.
So last up, as you know, my guests are asked to recommend 2 books to augment any golfer's library.
So you've already held up one of them, which is A Life in Golf by Peter Thompson,
which
is a collection of his newspaper columns from the Age over the years, and is...
If anybody... The last time I went looking for a copy, I do have a copy myself, but it was out of print, Slattery Media, obviously online. So, but anyway...
Yeah, I hope they do another print run at some point. You might find something on eBay or secondhand, or if you can get it, it is just...
It's that good, yeah.
It really is, and it's one of those books, and I love books like this. You can just sit down and open it up to any page. It's not like a narrative where it's a novel and it starts at the beginning and goes in. Open any page and there'll be something interesting about the game that he's chosen to write about, from Tiger Woods to bunkers to... The one piece that it doesn't have in it, I don't think, and it's one of the favourite things of his ever written. He did a review of the Australian Golf Club and he talked about the water being next to the greens. It's a very American thing, like fins on a Cadillac. It's how he described having water as it's next to the greens at the Australian. I've never been able to find that review again. But I think that's just a beautiful line. So he writes beautifully about the game and in a way that makes you think. You might not always agree with him, but it makes you think. And am I allowed to nominate books others have done? I don't know whether anybody has nominated The Links by Robert Hunter. I'd be surprised if they haven't.
That has been nominated, but yeah, certainly you can nominate
that one
again.
There. Or
that reinforces the fact that it's a good book.
That, or in fact, Shackleford's first sort of, I can't remember the name of the course design book for beginners.
Grounds for Golf.
Grounds for Golf, I think, is one that's great. But I'm going to recommend people, and yes, Shackleford is a friend of mine, but he's also a very interesting writer about the game. His new one that's coming out in the next couple of months, which is golf course architecture for
Normal people, yeah.
normal people, yeah. And I think that'll be fantastic.
You've had an advance copy of that.
I haven't.
You haven't?
Clates has. No, Clates has. And that tells you something about the pecking
It does.
order,
And
the state of the game crew.
I saw somebody else that had an advanced copy of that.
Matt
Actually
Mollica.
posted Matt Mollica, indeed. And it's actually
Mollica,
somebody
yeah.
else, again, I'm not sure who it was, had
Probably
a picture of it on
everybody
Twitter.
else. Yeah. I think that was Matt. Matt posted a picture of it on Twitter. Maybe...
He doesn't know me from a bar of soap, but he does know you, so...
Yeah, well, it tells you everything you need to know about me, doesn't it? Eh? He sent Clates one, but not me. But I think that'll be. I love the idea of that. All of the interest almost that I've had in golf course architecture for the last 10 years has been about how to try to pass that gift on to others without being evangelical about it and putting people off. I don't have kids, and I know what it's like when people tell you how much you're missing out on because you don't have kids. It's like, yeah, well, that's okay. I've chosen this. And so you don't want to be that person about golf course architecture to other people, but you do want to somehow allow more people to experience what a gift it is to have an interest in golf course architecture. And I think it really is a gift. It adds to the game elements that if your only interest in your golf is your score, it's going to be a very narrow and predominantly disappointing time in the game, I think, because those things never live up to what you want. The interest in, and to me, golf course architecture is the most interesting thing about the game, by far. It's what separates golf from the others. A football field's a football field. A golf course is not just a golf course. They're an integral part of the playing of the game at every level.
I've already taken up far too much of your Saturday morning. So, look, I'm very, very grateful for your time and for drawing back the curtain ever so slightly.
Well, you can see me, which the others can't, so that's
Yeah.
probably a good thing for them, yes.
Before I let you go, you might tell listeners how they can keep tracks on your writing, podcasting, and musings in general.
Okay, so it's not all that difficult. Golf Australia magazine on their website every Monday. I put up an opinion piece. Some I like more than others. One of the problems with having to produce something every week is that not every week do you have something you feel that you really want to necessarily talk about, but it generally tends to be pretty fun. So that's the Golf Australia magazine, golfaustralia.com.au. That's about the only place I write anything these days. You can, of course, tune into the Wound Doctors. No, I'm kidding. You go to...
Don't miss it.
Don't miss it. Latest episode out yesterday. Talking Golf Network, which the website's a bit problematic at the moment, and you and I have had discussions about how we might go about fixing that, but of course it comes to this issue where apparently I might have to spend some money on it. I don't like that idea. So the Talking Golf Network, talkinggolf.com, has all of the podcasts that I'm involved with. There's the Thing About Golf, which is we do for Golf Australia magazine. I do one, Huggy does one, I do one, Huggy does one, generally speaking. They're just in-depth interview shows with people. The Good podcast is mostly weekly with Logue, who we've mentioned a couple of times, and recently Jimmy Emanuel from Golf Australia magazine has joined us. I'm on that. I'll be a...
Sorry, do you have him in a box? You're pointing and looking across the studio. It's obviously where he usually sits, but it was almost as if you have him in a box.
Yeah, I don't know why. I just naturally was drawn to look at... There you go.
Jimmy, he had you locked up.
Can you hear that? Let me out. That's where he normally sits, Jimmy. They've also started a new podcast, which I'm on quite a bit, which is a weekly sort of preview and tip show for all the tournaments around the place. And, of course, State of the Game, as you mentioned, with Shackleford and Clayton, which is sporadic. Feel free to abuse me on Twitter because we don't release enough episodes. Plenty of others have in the past. It has no impact on the schedule, but it's often fun to read people abusing you for not releasing an episode. People will tell me,
and sometimes it actually turns into an episode.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So that's where you'll find me should you want to. If you haven't heard enough of me yet, I do sometimes worry that I'm a bit too. I appear in too many places. And this is one of the problems with writing a column, Shane. I only have really about 3 ideas. And I've been column writing now for about 5 years. It's very hard to continually recycle those same 3 ideas. I haven't had a new thought since the noughties. So that makes it awkward.
You're also the master of self-deprecation, my friend.
Yeah, maybe. Anyway. So that's what we do. And you can find me on Twitter if you like under my name, Rod_Morri, I think it is.
Until the next time, my friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shane. Most enjoyable.
Go easy.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Many thanks for tuning in. As usual, you can find us online at firmandfast.golf or on Twitter at firmandfastgolf. Please please continue to like, subscribe, and comment. It really is appreciated. Until the next time, happy golfing.